Everybody hear me? Everything is fine? Should we start? Okay, so, it's an emotional day, so I will try my best. Dear friends and colleagues, Professor Pinchasov, Ariel University Rector, Professor Gary Gellerman, our Dean, I would like to welcome you all and thank you all for joining us today for the Network Management and Service Orchestration Workshop held in memory of our late friend, Dr. Kirill Kogan. I must admit that this is an emotional day for me personally and for all my friends at Ariel University. Kirill was a personal friend of mine and a research partner. Indeed, Kirill was a member of our Department of Computer Science at Ariel University, an excellent and well-respected researcher in his field. However, when we think on Kirill, we know that first and foremost, he was a wonderful father of two lovely children and a loving son to his parents, a great family man. Kirill left a big hole in his heart of his family and friends, and this day is our humble way to honor his memory. I would like to welcome Professor Albert Pinchasov, Director of the University, to say a few words.
Thank you, Amit. Indeed, it's a very emotional day for us. Dear faculty members, participants of the conference, researchers, students, and guests. Thank you for joining us on this important day, the day we honor the memory of Dr. Kirill Kogan. Kirill was more than an outstanding scientist. As Amit said, he was a wonderful father, a great son, a kind colleague, an engaging lecturer, scientific advisor, and mentor. I open this conference with sadness and sorrow in my heart. Thinking about today's speech, I deliberately avoided the word was, as Kirill's legacy remains a significant part of the Department of Computer Science, specifically, and was the entire Ariel University. Kirill was taken from us too soon. As a young scientist, he had already accomplished so much, yet there was so much left to him to share with the university and the world through the breaking research and innovations and his passion for science and life, which energized everyone around him. I knew Kirill personally. He joined Ariel University in 2019 and immediately established himself as a promising researcher in the field of network algorithms and design of network systems. During his first year at the university, he won a substantial research grant and with it involved many young scientists. His lectures quickly became known and popular among students. I would like once again to express my sincere condolences to the whole family, to Kirill's parents, and to his children, Jonathan and Nicole. And to let you know that Ariel University stands with you in mourning the loss of Kirill. We are and will always be ready to help you in any situation with any issues. We hope in time that you, Jonathan and Nicole, will honor us by continuing your father's legacy and come to study at Ariel. We will greet you with open arms and an open heart, as you once embraced your beloved father. שיהיה זכרו ברוך. תודה רבה.
Thank you very much, Albert. Kirill devoted his research to the design, analysis, and implementation of network systems, and the topic of this workshop was chosen accordingly. We have 6 great speakers today, all of which worked with Kirill and knew him in person. I would like to thank each one of them in advance for making my job of finding speakers so easy, as they are all happy to take part and pay respect to the memory of Kirill. Thanks to Professor Sergei Krunivsky, Dr. Vitaly Demaniuk, Professor Stefan Schmidt, Dr. Gabor Retvari, Dr. Sergei Nikolenko, Professor Patrick Thomas, and Professor Antonio Fernandez Ante. Thank you very much. And we will start with the first speaker, Professor Sergei Krunivsky. Sergei?
Can you hear me?
Yes, let me introduce you, please. Professor Gornitsky is a Tuner Research Associate Professor of AMDA Network Institute in Madrid, Spain. He joined the institute in 2009 and leads the NetCom research group there. Dr. Gornitsky received his PhD and master degree from the University of Texas at Austin in the United States and engineer degree for Moscow Institute of Electronic Technology, Russia. His work is appeared to the top conference and journals such as CCOM, Connex, Infocom, and so on. Sergey, please.
Thank you very much. I'll be online, but I'll play my pre-recorded presentation. So feel free to interact me if you have any questions in the process. We can stop and continue presentation later, or I can take the questions at the end. Greetings from Spain. I'm Sergei Gorinsky, a research associate professor at the MDN Networks Institute in Madrid. The first time I met Kirill was in Bangalore, India at CompsNet 2013, where Kirill presented his paper on multi-queue network processes and, during a panel, asked a passionate question about the role of theory in networking research. This topic was of general importance to Kirill, who saw his scientific mission in network algorithm design based on solid analytical foundations. When Kirill applied later for an assistant professor position at MDN Networks, he didn't contact me. Upon Kirill's hiring by the Institute, Antonio Fernandez remarked that I just got a body. Antonio's comment turned true. Kirill started to come to my office on a daily basis, and we had long conversations. Kirill's quick mind, independent thinking, and research enthusiasm were immediately obvious. We published some papers together, and it was a pleasure to observe Kirill's professional supervision of his PhD students, Pavel Chuprikov and Vitaly Demyanyuk, with whom Kirill worked intensively and productively. In personal life, Kirill was witty and thoughtful, with deep insights into all kinds of issues, and handled setbacks with the same undaunted energy. When Kirill moved to Ariel University, I fully supported his desire to be close to his family and vibrant high-tech community in Israel. Kirill was happy at Ariel and appreciated the friendly atmosphere on its faculty and generous assistance provided to him. The last time I communicated with Kirill was in early February, when I congratulated him on the recognition as a distinguished member of the Infocom 2021 TPC. Kirill had so many plans in his professional and personal life. Then the incomprehensible end came suddenly. I will present two recent technical papers inspired by Kirill. The first one is our joint work with Vitaly on the topic of telemetry. We submitted the paper to EFIP Networking on January 21st, the day Kirill left for a visit abroad, where he contracted the coronavirus disease. The conference accepted the paper already after Kirill's death. The increasing scale and programmability of networks create new challenges and opportunities for their management. On one hand, the network behavior becomes more complex. On the other hand, the network can allocate more resources to understanding its distributed behavior. Independent telemetry frameworks collect distributed state via the data plane. Before sending a packet into the network, the source element places instructions into the special packet header depicted in this slide in yellow. As the packet traverses the network elements follow the instructions to collect data in the packet header as reflected by its changing color. When the packet reaches the destination element, the collected data are extracted from the packet header so that telemetry functions can compute their metrics. This paper considers a stream of packets
from source S to destination D and presents telenoise that supports telemetry for groups of packets within the stream. Examples of such per-group metrics in the real world include the loss rate and average bottleneck link buffer occupancy for a packet group. Per-group telemetry functions have a common need to compute their metrics correctly, despite network noise in the form of packet reordering and loss. Telenoise assures resilience to network noise by offering group affiliation and group completion as two primitives at destination D. Group affiliation determines the group of the received packet. Group completion detects whether D has already received all the packets that it can receive from this group. Telenoise has no explicit notion of time, and its n-band operation is driven solely by packet departures and arrivals. In particular, S partitions the stream into groups of G consecutive packets and adds only few control bits per packet. We established feasibility limits for telenoise and derive specific algorithms that meet these limits. To appreciate the challenges posed by network noise for per-group metric computation, consider a stream of 20 packets at source S. Telenoise partitions the stream into 5 groups sized to G equal 4 packets each. The network delivers 10 packets and loses the other 10, including 3 packets from group 0. Due to the packet loss and reordering, the first 3 packets received by D belong to groups 0, 1, and 2. To correctly compute the loss rate for group 0 as 75%, D has to attribute exactly 1 of the received packets to group 0. More generally, correct affiliation of packets with their groups at D is fundamental for noise-resilient computation of per-group metrics. How can we provide such affiliation? Telenoise operates on network-level packets as sent by S into the network and as received by D from the network. The design doesn't assume that the packets contain sequence numbers. Furthermore, to keep the communication overhead low, telenoise neither inserts packet sequence numbers nor generates any additional packets to support group affiliation. Instead, telenoise inserts into each packet at source S few control bits, which we call sync bits. This paper derives algorithms for telenoise at S and D that leverage the sync bits to guarantee that D correctly associates each received packet with its group. Regardless of the number of bits inserted into each packet, no algorithm can provide meaningful guarantees if maximum network noise is unconstrained. For example, if the network loses all the packets. We model maximum network noise through its local impact on the packet stream. Loss parameter L characterizes maximum packet loss by allowing the network to lose at most L consecutive packets. For example, if L is equal to 6 packets, the network may lose 6 consecutive packets, but destination D receives at least 1 packet from any sequence of 7 packets. Reordering parameter R constrains reordering to be at most by R packets. For example, if R is 4 packets, the packet with green sync bits may arrive to D before the 4 preceding packets or after the 4 subsequent packets, but not after any later packets or before any earlier packets in the stream. While our paper has more results, we present only those for the general model of maximum network noise, where loss is at most L consecutive packets and reordering is at most by R packets. Consider any deterministic algorithm that partitions the stream at S into groups of G consecutive packets and inserts T sync bits into each packet. The algorithm has its full discretion in how to set the sync bits in each packet at source S and how to interpret the sync bits in the packets received by D. Theorem 3 proves that no such algorithm can assure correct affiliation of packets with their groups if L in R exceeds 0 and L plus 2R is at least 2 to the power of T minus 1 multiplied by G packets. The main idea of the proof is to take a stream of packets with a sync bit set up by the algorithm and construct 2 different noise patterns so that the received packet sequences look the same at D with respect to the sync bits. But there is a position where the 2 received sequences have packets from 2 different groups. For example, packet 0 with yellow sync bits comes from group 0 in one sequence and from group 2 in the other sequence. In our telenoise algorithms, the sync bits play a more specific role. They denote a group type which is the same for all packets of the group. For each subsequent group, source S increments the group type modulo 2 to the power of t. This use of the sync bits allows us to think of the packet stream as the sequence of color-coded groups, where each group type with its specific color occurs periodically with period 2 to the power of t. In the example with t set to 2 bits, there are 4 group types colored yellow, green, blue, and magenta. And the stream of 20 packets can be viewed as a sequence of 5 groups, where groups 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 have type 0, 1, 2, 3, and again 0, respectively. This group-level view is helpful for explaining the operation of telenoise at destination D, and in particular in our algorithm 2. Variable n points at the first non-completed group. Given the maximum network noise, the algorithm maintains an invariant where the next packet can arrive only from the 2 to the power of t consecutive groups starting from group n. For example, with t set to 3 sync bits and n pointing to group 4, the next packet can arrive only from groups 4 through 11, because it's too early to receive a packet from the subsequent groups, and it's too late to have an arrival from groups 0 through 3, which are already announced as completed. Note that each of the 8 groups possible for next packet has a different type, denoted by a different color. When the next packet arrives, the destination associates the packet with a group having the same type as the sync bits in the packet. To do so, the destination calculates by how many groups the type in the sync bits overshoots the type of group n. In this example, the type in the sync bits of the next packet is orange and matches the orange type of group 4. Hence, the overshoot is 0 and the destination associates the packet with group 4. The algorithm also employs parameter delta to detect group completion. If the group of the received packet is within the delta groups from group n, as in our example where delta equals 3 groups, the destination concludes its processing of the packet without announcing any group completion. However, if the group of the received packet is outside the delta groups by some extra x groups, then the destination announces completion for other x groups, specifically for groups n through n plus x. For example, when another packet arrives and the group type in the sync bits is yellow, the destination detects the overshoot by 4 groups and associates the packet with yellow group 8, which is 2 groups outside the delta groups. Consequently, the destination announces completion for the 2 groups starting from group 4, which are groups 4 and 5. The announcement makes the interested telemetry functions aware that they can now compute metrics for the newly completed groups with assured correctness. Then the destination advances variable n to point to group 6 as the first non-completed group, and the next packet can arrive only from group 6 through 13. Theorem 4 proves that algorithm 2 guarantees correctness of group affiliation and group completion if R is at most delta minus 1 multiplied by G packets, and L plus R is at most 2 to the power of T minus delta multiplied by G minus 1 packets. These analytical assurances meet the feasibility limits. If we add the constraints on R and L plus R and invert the relation from less or equal to greater, we will obtain the constraints on L plus 2R in the infeasibility conditions of Theorem 3. Parameter delta controls a trade-off between the assured resilience to loss and reordering. When delta equals 1 group, algorithm 2 guarantees the highest resilience to loss, but assures no resilience to reordering. As delta increases, so does the reordering resilience. Number T of sync bits offers a trade-off between the communication overhead and overall assured resilience to network noise. Incrementing the value of T by 1 bit without changing delta and G relaxes the constraint on L plus R by at least twice. Due to uncertainty whether the missing packets are indeed lost or will still arrive, it is impossible for a telenoise algorithm to always detect a group completion instantaneously. We define the measurement lag for a group as the number of packets received by the destination between the moment when the group became completed and the moment where the algorithm detects the group completion. theorem 5 provides upper bounds on the measurement lag for each group and on average. In particular, the average measurement lag is at most delta minus 1 multiplied by g plus 1 packets. To reduce the average measurement lag significantly below this upper bound, we slightly modify algorithm 2 to derive algorithm 3, where the destination maintains packet counters for the first delta non-completed groups and immediately announces the completion of a group if all G packets of the group arrive. Our experimental evaluation adopts a distribution from prior work to generate realistic traffic traces and uses the YAP simulator in its unreliable transport configuration to transmit the generated packet streams over a leaf-spine network topology. The simulations examine the sensitivity of multiple metrics to a variety of parameters, including delta, group size G, number T of sync bits, network element buffer size, and congestion level. We evaluate how frequently our algorithms actually make at least one error when the feasibility conditions do not hold for the stream. When algorithms 2 and 3 are assuredly correct, we report the average measurement lag. With T set to 3 sync bits, this sample graph shows how the average lag of algorithm 3 grows with group size G for different delta values. The lag grows almost linearly, but stays one order of magnitude lower than the linear upper bound due to the group completion optimization in algorithm 3. For group sizes of at least 12 packets, T equal to 3 sync bits, and delta set to 2 groups, both algorithms 2 and 3 are assuredly correct, and algorithm 3 has an average measurement lag of at most 1.6 packets. To conclude, this paper proposed telenoise for per-group in-band telemetry. While per-group telemetry functions have a common need to robustly deal with network noise in the form of packet reordering and loss, telenoise satisfies this need via the primitives of group affiliation and group completion. The communication overhead is minimal and limited to few sync bits per packet. We analyze feasibility limits for guaranteed correctness of telenoise and design specific algorithms that meet these limits. Our trace-driven evaluation confirmed the effectiveness and efficiency of our approach. For example, the ability to guarantee correct operation and have an average measurement lag of at most 1.6 packets when adding 3 sync bits per packet and sizing the groups to 12 packets only. Now, I'll present the second piece, an invited paper that I promised to submit to IC3N by April. Back then, Kirill proposed to write the paper together. In early March, when I reached out to Kirill about writing the paper, Kirill was already in the coma, out of which he never came, and Skype still shows my message to him as unread. After Kirill's death, Pavel, Vitaly, and I wrote and dedicated to Kirill this new invited paper on the topic of equivalent classifier transformation pioneered by Kirill in his most impactful SecSpec article at SECOM 2014. We start by presenting background on packet classification and, in particular, equivalent transformation. Then, we propose prefix disjointness as a new basis for classifier conversion via algorithm PD transform. Based on PD transform, we design predicate that converts an arbitrary ternary classifier to prefix equivalence. Finally, we report an evaluation on class bench. Packet classification is critical for network operation and prescribes the action for the network element in accordance with the header of the received packet. Used initially for packet forwarding, classification supports many other causes, including quality of service, security, and network programmability. A packet classifier refers to a sequence of rules ordered in their decreasing priority. Each rule contains a filter and corresponding action. A packet matches a rule if fields in the packet header conform to the filter of the rule. An example of such fields is a 5 tuple that identifies the protocol, source and destination addresses, and port numbers. When the header matches one or more rules, the network element performs the action of the first matched rule. When the header matches no rule, the element executes a default action. Efficiency of packet classification depends on various factors, such as the classifier size and filter representation. It's natural for a human to express a filter via ranges of field values. For example, a filter can be specified as ranges 8 to 11 and 2 to 3 for two respective fields of 4 bits each. For computer processing, ranges are less suitable. One machine-friendly representation is via binary strings. In our example, the range filter can be expressed as 8 binary strings of 8 bits each. A compact machine-friendly alternative is to use ternary strings of zeros, ones, and wildcard characters that denote both 0 and 1. Then, our range filter can be expressed as one ternary string of 8 characters. Prefixes form a special type of ternary strings where bits precede wildcards. While the ternary filter in our example is not a prefix, permutation of its characters produces one. Why does the filter representation matter? It does because of the infrastructure available for packet classification. In particular, ternary strings appeal due to TCAM, or ternary content addressable memory, which stores ternary characters natively and looks up a ternary string in constant time. On the flip side, TCAM consumes a lot of power and has high cost. LPM, or longest prefix match infrastructures, offer a cheap alternative, designed originally for destination-based forwarding. Efficient LPM solutions exist on various platforms that do not use TCAM. However, LPM classification works only for prefixes, not general ternary strings. Semantically equivalent transformation converts a classifier to an equivalent such that for any given packet, both classifiers return the same action. The conversion enables more efficient classification, for example by making the classifier smaller or improving the filter representation. The approach exploits some property of practical classifiers and employs a transformation technique. For some techniques, the same transformation has to be applied also to the header before classifying it on the transformed classifier. When the property doesn't hold, it's common to partition the classifier and transform those components that have the property. Kirill's SaxPack article proposed the property of order independence. A classifier is order independent if any packet matches at most one of its rules. The respective technique removes filter columns as long as order independence still holds. For example, classifier K with 4 filter columns is order independent, and removing the last magenta column transforms K to classifier K prime with 3 filter columns. That same transformation narrows the header from 4 to 3 bits. Due to order independence, the transformed header matches at most one rule in the transformed classifier. When a match occurs, check C verifies it as a true positive by matching the original header against the original rule before returning the action of this rule, which for header 0001 is action A1. Check C ensures that the match on the transformed classifier is not a false positive. For header 0000, there is also a tentative match with rule R1, but the check against the original header fails and returns the default action. Another property is prefix reorderability, which refers to the ability to convert a ternary classifier to its prefix equivalent by permuting the filter columns. In this example, permutation of the red and orange columns transforms prefix reorderable classifier K to its prefix equivalent K prime. The same transformation permutes the red and orange bits in the header. For header 101, a match of transformed header 011 on the transformed classifier returns action A3. Our first contribution is a new property of prefix disjointness. A classifier is prefix disjoint if it's order independent and transformable to a prefix reorderable equivalent without violation of order independence. The respective wildcarding technique replaces a 0 or 1 in a filter with a wildcard. For example, classifier K is prefix disjoint, and wildcarding of the last character in its filter 1 and last 2 characters in filter 4 converts K to a prefix reorderable equivalent. Order independence ensures that any header matches at most one rule on the transformed classifier. Check C verifies validity of the match. For header 0110, the check confirms the tentative match with rule R4 as a true positive and returns action A4. For header 0111, The tentative match with rule R4 on the transform classifier turns out to be a false positive and results in the default action. Our analytical results on prefix disjointness include Theorem 1, the transform classifier is equivalent to the original. Theorem 2 shows that filter widening preserves prefix disjointness, which is not the case for prefix reorderability. Lemma 1 and 2 lay the foundations for our iterative algorithm PT transform that converts a prefix disjoint classifier to its prefix reorderable equivalent in time linear in the classifier size. Specifically, Lemma 1 defines the iterative step for the algorithm, and Lemma 2 stipulates how to check a current classifier for prefix disjointness. Finally, Theorem 3 proves correctness of PT transform. A key notion in PT transform is the all-exact set of the filter positions where all rules of current classifier K contain 0 or 1. We construct a counterpart of each rule in K by wildcarding those filter positions of the rule that are not in the all-exact set. An iteration by PT transform extracts from K each rule such that the characters in the all-exact set positions in this rule and in the other rules differ. Then, the iteration inserts the counterparts of the extracted rules into classifier K'. Initially, K contains the input classifier, and K' is empty. The first iteration creates the all-exact set from the orange position only, extracts rule R4 from K, and inserts counterpart rule R4' into K'. The second iteration adds the red position to the all-exact set, extracts rule R3 from K, and inserts counterpart rule R3' into K'. The last iteration adds the green position to the all-exact set, removes rules R1 and R2 from K, and inserts their counterparts R1' and R2' into K'. K becomes empty, and the algorithm outputs K' as a prefix reorderable equivalent of the input classifier. We combine PT transform with the existing methods to design predicate that converts an arbitrary ternary classifier to its prefix equivalence. First, if the classifier is not prefix disjoint, predicate splits it to prefix disjoint components. Because our theorem 4 shows that such partitioning isn't hard, we adopt a heuristic, which runs in time linear in the filter width and quadratic in the number of rows. Then, for each prefix disjoint component, predicate applies PT transform to construct a prefix reorderable equivalent, removes filter columns while preserving order independence, and previews the columns to produce a prefix equivalent of the component. In this example, classifier K is not prefix disjoint, and the first step of predicate partitions K into two prefix disjoint components, K1 and K2. Then, predicate uses PT transform to produce prefix reorderable equivalents of K1 and K2 by wildcarding of 3 characters in the first component and 1 character in the second. Further, predicate narrows the filters by removing the magenta column from the first component, as well as red and orange columns from the second. Finally, predicate permutes the red and orange columns in the first classifier, as well as magenta and green columns in the second classifier to output prefix equivalents. How does lookup work on the 2 prefix equivalents of the original classifier? For header 0110, predicate constructs headers for the first and second components and detects tentative matches with rules R4 and R6 respectively. Check C against the original header confirms both matches as true positives. Because rule R4 has a high priority, predicate returns action A4. For header 0101, predicate detects tentative matches with the rules R4 and R7 on the first and second components respectively. Because check C determines that both matches are false positives, predicate returns the default action. Our experiments on class bench consider 12 classifiers that include 5 access control lists, 5 firewalls, and 2 IP chains. We expand the range filters to ternary strings and evaluate the transformations of the ternary classifiers by predicate and 3 existing methods. LPMPR relies on prefix readability, converts the classifiers to prefix equivalents, and hence is the most natural comparison baseline. SexPack produces ternary classifiers, and exact uses SexPack restricted to binary representations. We evaluate the number of classifiers needed to represent 95, 99, and 100% of all rows, which corresponds to the number of necessary lookups. We always report results for exact in the original setting, where the filters contain 104 characters. For predicate, LPMPR, and SexPack, we examined both the original width and filters restricted to 32 characters. For the latter setting, this graph shows that predicate generally outperforms ternary to binary exact, with the number of lookups reduced by up to an order of magnitude. The advantage of predicate over ternary to prefix LPMPR is up to a factor of 5 and larger with the wide original filters. The numbers of lookups for predicate and ternary to ternary SexPack are similar, despite the ability of predicate to operate on cheaper, more power-efficient LPM infrastructure as opposed to TCAM. To sum up, we studied transformation of ternary classifiers to their prefix equivalents to enable efficient classification on LPM infrastructure. We propose the prefix disjointness property and wildcarding technique to convert a classifier to its order-independent prefix reorderable equivalents. Our algorithm PD transform checks for prefix disjointness and performs the transformation in time linear in the classifier size. We also design predicate that combines PD transform with existing methods to convert an arbitrary ternary classifier to its prefix equivalents. The experimental study complemented our analytical results and showed that predicate outperforms by up to a factor of 5 the state-of-the-art ternary to prefix method, up to an order of magnitude the ternary to binary method, and performs comparably with the ternary to ternary method that requires costly, power-hungry TCAM. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll be glad to answer questions about either telemetry or classification parts of the work.
Sergey, thank you very much. Any question?
About the telemetry paper.
Yes.
There is basically you could use sequential numbers for all the packets, but instead you use the overhead bits. So, how is the overhead compared to using sequential numbers on all the packets?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So essentially what we use, what we call sync bits, are essentially partial numbers, which are used for some window, which is relatively small. So I think the overhead is basically comes from the comparison of this window as opposed to the stream size. So I know if you have,
yes, because it's comparable to the stream size. Okay.
Yes, the stream size is large, then you need to number a lot of packets, but you actually don't need to. So that one of the objective was to do it with minimum communication overhead, and adding just few bits per packet was one of the objectives.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? If no, thanks, Sergey. Sergey, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing the workshops. I think Kirill was a special person for many of us. And unfortunately, didn't have much time to spend with him. He was 5 years in Madrid, and he left good memories. And knowing Kirill with his energy, enthusiasm, he was so strong, healthy, caring. So you wouldn't think that would happen to him. So it came as a complete shock. So you think of the person to have so many plans for the future, and it just comes to such a sad end. So thank you once again for organizing this event. He really deserved to be remembered by the community. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you for participating. Okay, our next speaker, Dr. Vitaly Demaniuk, received the BSc and MSc degree in Applied Mathematics and Computer Science and ITMU University. He started to work with Kirill in 2017 as a PhD student. Vitaly defended his PhD thesis at the Higher School of Economics under the joint supervision of Kirill Kogan and Sergei Nikolenko. After graduation, Vitaly continued to work with Kirill as a postdoc fellow at Ariel University. Vitaly?
Do you hear me?
Yes, you want to share your presentation?
Yeah. Do you see
Okay.
the,
Yeah, we are seeing. We see this presentation.
okay, I will start.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. Today I present approximate and robust approaches to the packet classification problem. I started to work with Kirill on June 2017 by the recommendation of another Kirill student, Pavel Chuprikov. When Pavel asked me if I want to be a student of Kirill, I thought, why not? This was the best decision in my scientific career. Kirill was an extremely good supervisor. During my first days of PhD studies, Kirill redefined a suitable problem for me, and already in 2 months we received the first results. Kirill spent enormous effort for the education and academic growth of his students. For instance, he could answer questions and help with the paper even at 3 a.m. weekend day. Kirill was a brilliant researcher. He was always open to new ideas, provides many new scientific directions, and new ways to look on already existing problems. His huge industrial experience allows him easily to determine the applicability and potential impact of various methods and network design decisions. He left behind a lot of new ideas and unfinished projects. Some of them I hope to finish in near future. I'm very thankful to Kirill for all the time and effort he spent into me. I hope in my future I will be the same supervisor as Kirill was to me. I worked with Kirill in 4 different directions. In the first direction, we study efficient representations of packet processing programs that usually consist of packet classifiers. This is the most common direction for our joint work. We also did 2 projects dealing with in-band network telemetry. In particular, telenoise previously discussed by Sergei was one of these projects. We developed a data center congestion control algorithm that simultaneously based on shortest remaining processing time and does not require prior knowledge of flow size. We also designed efficient representations of network topologies. Today, I focus on the first direction. In the era of software-defined networking, the behavior of network elements on data plane is specified by special packet processing programs. Due to efficiency constraints, various domain-specific languages have been proposed to declare such programs. For instance, the language part of the well-known protocol OpenFlow, or its derivative P4. Today, P4 becomes de facto standard for the packet processing program's definition. In these languages, programs consist of one or multiple packet classifiers. In a nutshell, packet classifier is a prioritized set of rules, where each rule consists of 2 parts, a filter matching lookup keys constructed for incoming packets, and an action that should be applied to a packet if its lookup key is matched by a filter. Filter is a sequence of fields, where in the most general form, fields are represented by ranges of values. In the example, you can see classifier consisting of 3 rules, and each filter of each rule consists of 3 fields. When a packet arrives to a network element, we gather from its header and other sources field values corresponding to fields in the the classifier and check that these field values belong to the corresponding ranges. Formally, a lookup key consisting of field values is matched by rule if field values in this lookup key are matched by the corresponding fields of filter of this rule. In the example, a lookup key H is not matched by rule R1, since field value 8 does not belong to the field that is arranged from 9 to 16. At the same time, H is matched by rule R3. Hence, the classification result is action A3. In the general case, the goal of the classification process is to determine the action of a first matching rule. The expressiveness of packet processing programs and corresponding packet classifiers depends on the number of fields involved into classification, number of rules, and how fields are represented. In the simplest case, fields are represented by exact values. Such representation allows to find a first matching rule in a constant time using algorithms for k-value stores. Unfortunately, the number of rules in this representation can be very big or even infeasible to fit in memory. In other extreme case, fields are represented by ranges of values. Such representation allows to significantly reduce the number of classification rules. In particular, this classifier consisting of 2 rules is equivalent to this classifier consisting of 8 rules. Unfortunately, the second representation suffers from inefficient polylogarithmic lookup time. As a result, an intermediate form of classifier representation was proposed. In this representation, each field is represented by ternary bit string, where each bit equals 0, 1, or don't care. Don't care means that the value of bit in a lookup key at the corresponding position can be any. For the third representation, a special memory TCAM was proposed. This memory allows to find a first matching rule in a constant time. Unfortunately, TCAM is very expensive and power-consuming. In particular, the cost of TCAM can be comparable to the cost of network processor. Hence, the efficiency of ternary classifier representation significantly affects the efficiency of the whole network and should be minimized. I did with Kirill 4 projects related to the packet classification. In the first project, we propose efficient representations of multiple classifiers sharing same classification pattern. This representation allows to store in TCAM repeating classification patterns only once, even if these patterns appear in many classifiers. In the second project, we propose efficient encoding of range-based packet classifiers into ternary classifiers by extending the ideas of previous Kirill work, SAXPAC. We also introduced a notion of approximate and robust packet classifier. Approximate classifiers allows to trade the classification accuracy for the additional reduction of classification rules. Robust classifiers can recover classification results even for lookup keys with missing fields. Among these 4 directions, Kirill liked the last 2 the most, since the last 2 projects provide new ways to look on already existing problems. Both these projects was published at Infocom. I start with approximate classifiers. First, to motivate the notion of approximate classifiers, we introduce the following 2 examples. In the first examples, rules map lookup key to a quantitative characteristic, for instance latency, that is further aggregated into a service class. And the goal of the classification is to determine the service class. In the example, values from 2 to 3 correspond to gold service class, and values from 4 to 6 correspond to silver service class. This classifier is irreducible It means that we cannot remove any rule or merge any two rules without breaking the classification accuracy. Observe that values assigned to rules R3 and R4 differ only by 1. Hence, we can assume that all lookup keys matched either by R3 or by R4 can be mapped either to gold service class or to silver service class. Such generalization allows to merge the second rule with the fourth rule, since filters of these two rules differ only in one position, and both these rules can map lookup keys to a gold service class. Similarly, we can remove the third rule, since all lookup keys matched by the third rule are also matched by the fifth rule that maps lookup keys to the silver service class. As you can see, the notion of approximate classifier allows us to remove two rules even in the irreducible regular classifier. In the second example, we consider approximate forwarding tables that map lookup keys to alternatives based on length of corresponding paths. Consider the following example. A lookup key H is matched by rule R3. Hence, the corresponding packet leaves the network element through port P2. The path of this packet consists of two links. Observe that the network contains another path for this packet consisting of two links. The second path starts from port P1. Hence, we can extend the classification results for rule R3 by an additional alternative. Such extension allows us to remove the first two rules, since all lookup keys matched by these two rules can be also matched by the third rule into port P1. Now, I formally define a notion of approximate classifier. In traditional packet classifiers, each rule is associated with only one action. But in approximate classifiers, each rule is associated with action set that contains all valid classification results for the corresponding rule. In the example, the action set of rule R3 contains A3 action and A5. The lookup key H is matched by the rule R3. Hence, the valid classification result for lookup key H can be either action A3 or action A5. Our goal is to use this flexibility in action sets to minimize the size of approximate classifier. In the example, we can remove the rule R1 since all lookup keys are matched by R1 are also matched by R4. After the removal of R1, we should shrink the action set of rule R4 to the set containing only A1. Previous work minimizes regular packet classifiers using basic reduction operators that are taken from Boolean minimization techniques. Typically, this work considers the following three operations: forward subsumption, backward subsumption, resolution. In this work, we generalized these operations to the case of approximate classifier. Before describing the operation generalization, I introduced a notion of rule covering and rule intersection. A rule Ri covers a rule Rj if all lookup keys matched by Ri are also matched by Rj. In the example, you can see that Ri covers Rj. Rules intersect if there is a lookup key matched by both of them. In the example, Ri intersects with Rj since both these rules can map lookup key 0, 1, 1, 0. I start with a forward subsumption. Consider two rules where a rule with higher priority Ri covers a rule with lower priority Rj. In this case, we can remove rule Rj since all lookup keys matched Rj will be classified by Ri. In the example, we can remove rule R3 since it is covered by rule R1. Observe that this operation does not depend on action. Hence, its implementation remains the same for both regular and approximate classifiers. Now I turn to backward subsumption. In the case of backward subsumption, a rule with lower priority Rj covers a rule with higher priority Ri. Backward subsumption removes Ri. Let us take a look on lookup keys that were classified by Ri. After the removal of Ri, these lookup keys will be classified either by Rj or by rules that intersect with Ri and are located in classifier between Ri and Rj. Hence, in the case of regular classifiers, the backward subsumption is applicable only if actions of all these rules coincide with the action of Ri. In the example, we can remove rule R1 since it is covered by R4. The action of R1 coincides with the action of R3 intersecting with R1 and with the action of R4. In the case of approximate classifiers, the situation is similar. Backward subsumption for rule Rj and every rule that intersects with Ri and is located in classifier between Ri and Rj intersects its action set with the action set of Ri. In the example, backward subsumption shrinks the action set of rule R3 to the set containing only action A2. Since R3 intersects with R1 and A3 does not belong to the action set of the rule R1. Similarly, backward subsumption shrinks the action set of rule R4 to the set containing only A1. In the case of approximate classifiers, backward subsumption is applicable only if after all reductions of action sets, all this action set will be non-empty. The third operation is resolution that comes from propositional logic. Consider two rules whose filters coincide in all bit indices except k, and the kth bit is not don't care in both these filters. Resolution merges these two rules, places the merged rule into the place of Ri and replaces the different case bit by don't care. In the example, resolution merges R1 with R4 and replaces the last bit in the combined rule by don't care. Let's consider lookup. Observe that after rule merging, all lookup keys that were classified by Rj or by a rule that is located in the classifier between Ri and Rj and that intersects with Rj after the merge of Ri Rj will be classified by the combined rule. Hence, in the case of regular classifiers, resolution is applicable if and only if the actions of all these rules coincide with the action of Ri. In the example, we can merge R4 with R1 since the action of R4 coincides with the action of R3 and with the action of R1. In the case of approximate classifiers, the action set of the combined rule is an intersection of the action set of rule Ri, the action set of rule Rj, and the action set of every rule that is located between Ri and Rj, and that intersects with Rj. In the example, the action set of the combined rule contains only action A2, since A2 belongs to the action set of R1, R3, and R4. Hypothetically, instead of operator generalization, we could assign a specific action for each rule in the approximate classifier, and then apply operations designed for the regular classifier minimization. Unfortunately, such method suffers from the following two disadvantages. First, the number of regular classifiers that can be obtained from approximate classifier in such a way is exponentially big. Second, the applicability of generalized operations is strictly better than the applicability of original operations. Consider the following example. In this example, we can apply only backward generalized version of backward subsumption. Any exact classifier that can be constructed from this approximate classifier is irreducible. Similarly, to apply two resolutions, we should use their generalized version in this classifier. The definition of approximate classifier, motivation of approximate classifier, and operator generalization was only the first steps in this direction. We also develop many algorithms that applies these operations, study properties of these algorithms, propose the optimal algorithm for the case of approximate LCPM classifiers, and confirm the efficiency of approximate classifiers by extensive evaluation study. All these steps can be found in the last journal paper. Now I briefly describe robust classifiers. Traditionally, fields in a lookup key are gathered from packet headers. However, with the growth of expressiveness of packet processing programs, new types of fields may appear. For instance, if we classify a group of packets, the lookup key can contain fields from many packet headers. Fields can be extracted from packet payloads that require complex parsing, like IP option. In the packet processing pipeline, the result in one classifier can generate fields for the subsequent classifier. Fields also can be collected from internal database. As you can see, the calculation of all these types of fields can be very complex or even infeasible. Hence, the reasonable question appears: how to recover the classification results only by a subset of fields? In the example, we try to classify a lookup key with missing second field. In this work, we propose the infrastructure PCL allowing to construct robust classifier representations that can recover classification results only by a subset of fields. The basic element in the proposed representations is approximation that classifies lookup key only by a subset of fields E, denoted as execution behavior. Unfortunately, only fields in E are not always can recover the classification result. Hence, we introduce an additional entity called similarity function, whose main responsibility is to fulfill the missing knowledge. Similarity functions can be based on different design principles. They can use structural properties of classifiers, information about traffic patterns, machine learning methods, and so on. Formally, an approximation is a classifier containing only fields from the execution behavior and containing similarity functions instead of actions. In the example, we classify lookup key with missing second and third field. This lookup key is matched by the second rule. Hence, the classification result is the result of the second similarity function. Note that the number of fields in the execution behavior controls a fundamental trade-off between complexity of the lookup key construction and approximation accuracy. Unfortunately, the availability of fields can vary in time. Hence, to improve the classification robustness, the proposed representation may consist of multiple approximations. In the example, you can see the representation consisting of two approximations. This representation can classify lookup key containing the first field and either the fourth field or the third field. If the incoming lookup key contains both the third and the fourth field, we classify it by approximation whose filters have better structural properties. Now let's take a look on the whole infrastructure. PCL. This infrastructure collects information about availability of fields or complexity of field calculations from target instances, and then according to this information and according to information about pre-resources, proposes for these target instances representations consisting of one or multiple approximations. In the example, PCL constructs a representation consisting of one approximation for target instance T1 and a representation consisting of two approximations for target instance T3. You can see that the construction of approximations is transparent to the programmer defining packet classifiers. Note that in case of TICA memory, the maintenance of multiple approximations is not more expensive than the maintenance of the classifier, since TCAM has a feature GMR allowing dynamically exclude fields from the classification. In the paper, we described various methods that define how to determine the number of approximations, how to choose fields for the execution behavior, how to select similarity functions from the library of similarity functions, and so on. We also designed 4 different similarity functions that based on structural properties of classifiers and partial knowledge about traffic patterns. We believe that the library of similarity functions can be significantly extended by machine learning methods and plan to incorporate this abstraction into the language P4. Thank you very much.
Vitaly?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any question? Vitaly, I want to ask you, please, if you can elaborate, please, about the idea of using machine learning with the similarity function.
The main job for the similarity function is to recover the knowledge that was lost that was contained in missing fields, and we think that machine learning methods can predict the value of the classification result if some fields are missing, but we just started to think about machine learning methods.
Okay, thank you very much. Vitaly, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So our next speakers are Professor Stefan Schmidt from TU Berlin, Germany, and Dr. Gabor Redvari from BME, Hungary. Stefan, Gabor?
Hi, can you hear me and see the slides?
Let me just present you. You were going to present on Kirill contribution to packet classification and an example why it's matter. And Professor Stefan Schmidt is a professor at the Technical University of Berlin, Germany, working also at the Fraunhofer Institute for Secure Information Technology. He obtained his diploma in computer science at ETH Zurich and also in his PhD. And since 2021, he's a member of the Council of the European Association of Theoretical Computer Science and the editor-in-chief of the EATC. And Dr. Gabor Redvari, I say it correctly, Gabor?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Received the MSc and PhD degree in electronic engineering from the Budapest University of Technology and Economics. He is now a senior research fellow at the Department of Telecommunication and Media Informatics and a part-time senior research fellow at the Ericsson Research, Hungary. His research interests include programmable hardware and software switch and routers design, scalable routing, architecture, algorithm, and data structure. Stefan and Gabor, thank you very much, and go ahead.
So thank you very much for the invitation. So you may wonder why Gabor and I do this together. So you will understand in a second. Maybe some words. I know Kirill actually from many occasions. I think the first time we met was at IMDEA. When I visited there also had a lot of discussion with him in person. And then around the world, I met him many times again. I think the last time we met in person was in Arizona at the Infocom TPC meeting, where we also made a short excursion with Marco Chiesa and other friends. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to work on a paper with Kirill, but actually we had other collaborations, like we work on a EU project, and actually his work inspired a lot of our work. And one of it is this project I have with Gabor. And that's one part of this talk. So Gabor and I are both friends and colleagues of Kirill, and Gabor and I have one project that is inspired and built upon Kirill's work. So this is a Hungarian and Austrian joint project where it's about algorithms for the data plane. Okay, and obviously there we have a lot of connections to Kirill's work. And in particular, in this talk, we want to show an example what can go wrong if you're not having rigorous solutions like Kirill has been developing. And I want to show one of these weaknesses of existing system, and then we actually want to present a beautiful idea that Kirill had to make such packet classification more efficient and avoiding also these kind of problems. So I think that's the rough plan, and that's why I thought it's a nice idea if Gabor and I do this together. Good. So the agenda is, I want to present some of these algorithms in the data plane that we have today, and in particular, we want to talk about tuple space search. And as an example, what can go wrong there if you are not having rigorous algorithms in the data plane is we want to give an example on OVS, an attack on OVS, algorithmic complexity attack, that shows a weakness of the tuple space search. And then Gabor will present a nice solution that Kirill and he developed in this context, a publication we have together. Gabor, you want to give a quick background on the packet classification?
Thank you. Yes. Hi everyone. I'm just maybe also want to quickly comment on how I first met Kirill. This was in Jerusalem when I visited Professor Michael Shapira. And then he actually just showed up near my desk and started to immediately chat about some of his ideas that he had driving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and then we immediately started to talk. And I don't know, we spent endless afternoons in the garden of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, just discussing all these ideas that he had. I have never really met anyone who had that many ideas on different aspects of data structures and algorithms in networking. So I really enjoyed these discussions, and just for to actually demonstrate the creativity that Kirill actually showed in all these areas. I would really love, we would really just to show you just one very high level example of how just twisting and tweaking a well-known 20-year-old cornerstone algorithm of packet classification, he immediately came up with an amazing generalization that eventually brought nice improvements. But first of all, we need to say a couple of words about packet classification. And this is, I think, the third talk that introduces this concept. So we will really be super high level. The big idea here is, again, that we have we are given an ordered list of wildcard or ternary rules. These are just, imagine these are super simple regular expressions on the bits, on the relevant bits of a packet's header. And then our idea or our task is to find the first rule that matches a given packet header. So packet comes in. We start to match the rules one after the other, these simple regular expressions. And the first time we find a match, we report this match to the data plane and go on with the processing. It's very easy to see that exact matching and longest prefix matching are simpler subproblems of general packet classification. Exact matching is used in, for instance, VLAN MacLearning tables. Things like that, and longest prefix matching is the kind of packet classification task that underlies the whole internet and destination-based routing in the IPv4 and the IPv6 internet. So these are really cornerstone problems and algorithmic solutions in packet networks. Now, packet classification, the general idea when you don't need to have all the wildcard bits in the suffix of your rules. So this general problem is basically indispensable at this point in packet processing. Practice, firewalls, and access control list, quality of service shapers, rate limiters, and classifiers. With the introduction of the software-defined networking data planes like in OpenFlow and P4, the match action processing tables are pretty often defined, and on ternary rules, policy routing, accounting, and billing. So all these different areas require fast and efficient packet classifiers. This is just a very simple example where you can see that, this is basically an access control list where we actually allow HTTP traffic from a certain subset of IP addresses and DNS traffic from another subset of IP prefixes, and then we deny everything else. So the idea here is that you have different fields of packet header bits, and then you can have these multi-dimensional filters defined on these filters, and all these filters can have wildcard bit positions when we say that certain bits are not interesting to us, and the action that is associated with each filter might report, for instance, to allow the further processing of a particular packet, or just basically drop it. Stefan, can you maybe go to the next? Thank you. The general rule of thumb is that packet classification is easy in hardware. Why I say it's easy in it's not because the TCAMs are amongst the most complex and most difficult and most power hungry chips ever invented and then ever used in networking. So this is really not easy, but we say that the problem is basically solved in hardware. But in software, this is notoriously difficult. I don't really want to go into the details about this venerable lower bound of the area, but the idea here is that when you have n rows and k greater than equal to 2 fields or packet fields, then the lower bound applies that you either process packets very fast, so in logarithmic time, but then the space becomes exponential, or it's the other way around. You can have linear space, but then your processing times becomes exponentially huge. And then there are, of course, there are different trade-offs between these extremes. But this is the typical space-time trade-off we very often have in networking and basically in all data structures. And packet classification is amongst those problem spaces where these space-time trade-offs are especially constraining. Okay, the difficulty stems here from the fact that rules can have wildcard bits wherever you don't have wildcard bits. So we have exact matches. The problem is very simple. So we can have these don't curve bits, and therefore rules might overlap. So there are the certain dependencies between these rules. Whenever a particular packet is matched by multiple rules at the same time, but the problem is that we need to find the first matching rule or the highest priority matching rule, and this basically just for an naive approach, this basically would require to match each and every rule in a linear lookup algorithm because the highest priority rule we could argue cannot be found yet any other way. Of course, whenever you find such notoriously difficult problems in software, these are the perfect grounds to come up with heuristics. And in fact, the current practice of networking pretty much relies on these sorts of heuristics. Of course, linear search, this is the simplest and the most often used solution in simpler cases, but it's of course very slow. Hierarchical tries, tuple space search, we are going to say a couple of words about this in the coming slides. Decision trees, geometric and cut-based heuristics, so all these different areas. Recently, machine learning-based approaches like neurocuts. As you've seen in the previous presentations, Kirill was highly active in this area. I just highlight four of his, at least for me, most relevant references in this field, but he has endless many ideas about how to do this right. Stefan, thank you. Tuple space search, basically 20 years old algorithm. The idea is that so whenever in computer science you have a complex problem and you don't really have a good solution for that, but you have a very simple case that you can solve efficiently, then it's a very nice way to actually solve the complex program by actually turning the complex problem into several instances of this simple problem that you can efficiently solve, and then solve these simpler problems instead of the complex one. Of course, the price that you pay is basically increased processing time because you have to execute the simpler algorithms countless many times. Here is one example. The complex program is generic packet classification. We don't really have good algorithms for that, but we have very good algorithms for exact matching, which is a subset of general packet classification. So here is the idea. Let's just decompose a generic packet classifier defined on W bits into at most 2 to the W exact match instances. And then we can just execute these exact match instances. And the idea here is that we will be able to recover the solution to the original problem by solving these exact match instances. The idea here is that we find all combinations of wildcard bit positions in the rules. These are called tuples, and I'm going to give an example in the next slide. For each tuple, we create a hash on the non-wildcard bit position. So we create a mask that will mask all the rules and the packet headers to the non-wildcard bit positions for each tuple. And then whenever a packet comes in, we basically just take hashes one after the other. We mask the packet to the relevant bits of each tuple, and then we just make a match for these relevant bits in the hash that belongs to the tuple. We might find multiple matches, but then we basically just at the end we just return the highest priority match from the results. Don't worry if you don't get this idea just right now. We're going to give an example in the next slide. The big idea here is that, of course, this problem or this algorithm has the lookup complexity is contingent on the number of hash lookups, and so the number of tuples that you have to check for each packet. This can be exponential in the worst case. This is not surprising because the lower bound that I showed you earlier is basically exponential. But the big idea and the heuristic nature of this algorithm is that typically the number of tuples is much fewer than the worst case exponential graph. Stefan? Thank you. So here's an example. This is an IPv6 forwarding table. The width is 128. This is supposed to be a rather huge number, but in this case, we only have prefix rows. We already seen these prefix rows. Whenever the rules have this nice property that the wildcard bits only appear in the last positions, or the suffix of each rule, and this is called the longest prefix matching. The idea here is that in the left-hand side table, you just see IPv6 prefixes. If you don't know this notation for IPv6, don't worry about that. On the right-hand side, you can see basically the filter bits spelled out. We have 4 bit positions, 0 to 3, and 4 rules, F1 to F4. And the idea is that for instance, the first filter, this matches a packet if and only if the first 4 bits of a packet is 1, 0, 0, 0, and so on for F2, F3, and F4. And priority grows upwards in the table, so F1 has the highest priority, and so on. Okay. The idea here is that tuple space search actually decomposes this complex-ish set of rules into 3 different tuples. So if you take a look at F1, you're going to see that the wildcard bit positions, there are basically no wildcard bits here. So this immediately will be 1 tuple, and this is the only rule that has no wildcard bit. So this will be going to the first tuple, and F1 will be the only rule in this tuple. So we basically don't need to mask anything. All the bits are relevant. And then we have the first tuple, as you can see in the slide. The second and the fourth, so rule F2 and F3, they have non-wildcard bits in the first 2 positions and wildcard bits in the last 2 positions. So these rules will go into the same tuple. This will be the second hash. As you can see, the second hash contains F2 and F3, but the bits are actually just, bit positions are masked to the relevant bits, so the first 2 bits, and we actually ignore the last 2 bits. And then, as you can see, the last tuple it contains only the last packet field. It's only just matches on the first bit of the packet. As you can see, input 0111 matches only the second hash. But for instance, 1100, it matches both the second and the third tuple, so F3 and F4. But since F3 is the higher priority from F3 and F4, the match will return F3. The good news here is that the number of tuples that we have, so the number of hash lookups that we have to perform to find a match for any packet is just 3, which is much smaller than the worst case. Here, the worst case could be 16, like it's only just the prefixes, somewhat smaller, but this is just for simplicity. The idea is working for the generic case as well. Okay, so there are just these 2 prerequisites or 2 principles that is required for tuple space search to work. And these 2 principles we are going to recall in a minute is that each rule must map to a single and only a single tuple and must appear only in a single hash. So this is the first principle of tuple space search. And then the second principle is that rules for each tuple must admit an exact match lookup. Okay, as long as this is true, tuple space search will work, and all people in the audience who are familiar with Kirill's earlier work will immediately observe that the second principle is basically the requirement of order independence. This cornerstone contribution of Kirill to this area, where he observed that order independence is key to packet classification. And now I would like to give the word to Stefan, and then we're going to return to tuple space search in a minute. Stefan?
Okay, thank you very much, Gabor. So as Gabor said, this tuple space search seems to be quite a good heuristic in general. However, in the worst case, it can lead to explosions, and that's one of the motivations here we want to quickly show you. The bigger context, maybe some of you have heard of this algorithmic complexity attacks. So this has recently received quite a bit of attention, also recently in the networking community. So this is about exploiting weak points of an algorithm. In this case, algorithm in software in the data plane, for example. There are other well-known examples. Maybe you know the billion laughs attack. That's one of an attack on an XML parser that allows you to exponentially expand some text. So in the original attack, it was lol. That's also why it's called billion laughs. And then recursively, a simple query allows it to explode the entire answer of the XML parser. Another well-known example in the general context is the zip bomb. Maybe some of you have heard of that. That's an attack on a virus scanner. So if the virus scanner tries to unpack an archive or a file, they do that to check for viruses. Then this can actually lead to a resource explosion, because this bomb, what it does, it uses a very, very big file, but a very simple file that you can compress a lot. For example, all 1.111. And once the virus scanner tries to unpack the archive, then this original file is huge. And then, of course, it's kind of a denial of service attack on the virus scanner. Nowadays, since this zip bomb, the first zip bombs, the virus scanners can actually detect such a file that will explode if you unpack it. But originally, this was one of the well-known attacks there. So these algorithmic complexity attacks are also a threat for network algorithms. And as a motivation here, what would you like to show you is this algorithmic complexity attack on tuple space search. So we have recently shown with Gabor that you can create situations where the tuple space search leads to such explosions. And the example I want to give is related to Open vSwitch. So this is one of the main virtual switches that is running in data centers. And it uses a cache that is called the Megaflow cache. And yeah, an attack on OVS is critical because a lot of data centers deployed at the edge such virtual switches. So this is kind of the de facto standard of network virtualization in data centers. So it's critical that these algorithms are of course robust and resilient there. Okay, so I just want to show you quickly this idea of this attack. So it's we can assume here a simple float table that simply allows some of the rules traffic but drops others. So it simply has a allow kind of primitive there. And the OVS architecture is consisting of a slow path and a fast path. Okay, so this OVS kernel module is the fast path, and then you have the vSwitch D in the user space that corresponds to a slow path there. And OVS switch uses a Megaflow cache, as I mentioned. And the idea is that the first packet is like going through the full table processing, and then flow-specific rules and actions are cached in the Megaflow cache. And entries matching on the same headers are collected into such a hash. And then masked packet headers, they can be found fast due to this architecture. And then, however, the problem with this approach is, or due to the architecture, is that masks and the hashes they are associated with, they are searched sequentially. So you basically have a linear search through these hashes. And this in principle is no problem, but if the number of masks can explode or can be large, then such a search can be very harmful, can eat a lot of resources of the virtual switch. Okay, so that's basically the idea to exploit here. So specifically, our finding here is that if you have many masks, if you can create many masks, then the packet processing will be very slow. So what you can try to do as an attacker, and it's relatively simple attack, is just try for each packet for the allow rule, so this rule that allows the traffic in the OVS, to add a packet with the relevant bits inverted. So we basically, for each packet, we have one mask, and then we have always the bits inverted correspondingly. So the problem arises if you have multiple allow rules and you have multiple header fields, then you can basically make an explosion, explosive growth of the corresponding masks and then of the corresponding search cost. So, and as a demonstration that this is a real issue, we basically could show that with a very small amount of traffic, so less than 1 megabit per second, if you have a packet sequence of this low rate, it's already possible to basically reduce the performance of the OVS switch almost to 0%, although the capacity of the switch would be significantly higher. So it's a relatively low resource attack, relatively simple attack for an adversary to execute. Right, so that's one of the motivations what can go wrong here. And now I would like to present you one of the ideas that Kirill contributed to overcome such issues and improve the efficiency of the TSS algorithm, a more general version. Gabor, you want to take back?
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, tuple space search, the efficiency of tuple space search is actually contingent on a number of different tuples and a number of different masks and hashes that we have to apply one after the other to find the most or the highest priority match. If there are lots of masks, there can be a huge problem, as you can see in the previous couple of slides. So tuple space search is super simple. It's just an implementation. We quite regularly set tuple space search implementations for on one of our master student courses for people that actually just play with data plane algorithms. Most of the time, people can actually come up with some 50 to 100 lines of Python to just actually code the basic idea. So this is really super simple. We find tuple space search in many different areas of packet classification, even somewhere where you wouldn't really actually expect such a simple heuristic to work. Very simple, but it can be very slow if the number of hashes grows huge. And this is an algorithmic corner case that bad actors can actually exploit to cause a denial of service attack. Of course, the problem came up how to decrease the number of tuples or hashes. If the number of tuples and the number of different hashes can mean a problem, let's just try to reduce. Let's find clever ideas to actually just decrease the number of hashes, and then this problem will be maybe mitigated. So here is just recall these invariants of tuple space search. Each rule in the rule set must uniquely map to a single hash. Okay, so the rule just can only just show up in at least or at most one hash. And the other invariant that we used in this area is that rules for each hash must be, of course, order independent. You couldn't really use a hash if they were not, but these are the two invariants that maybe on a mile-high view summarize all these requirements for tuple space search to actually work. Now here was Kirill's observation. Rules that belong to different tuples can still be assigned into a single hash. So even though the two rules belong to different tuples, and this only just constrained on the position of wildcard bits in the rules, even if the positions are different, we can still assign these rules into a single hash as long as these prerequisites hold. Okay, it's not tuples that count. What counts is these two invariants, and this is why I just keep on being surprised by this clarity of this observation. This is typical, I think, of Kirill's work, that this is a super simple idea, but it just didn't occur to me until actually Kirill just came up with this idea and showed that this observation can work. Okay, so the idea here is that if you can assign rules that originally belong to different tuples into a single hash, then this is an opportunity for you to reduce the number of hash lookups that you have to do. to get a match for a packet, and this will bring down the complexity, the time complexity of your heuristics. Can we just page the? Okay, I give you the idea, but it will be super difficult to understand from this. So we're going to see an example in the next slide. The idea was that what we called is a strong reduced order independent decompositions, but now I'm thinking that maybe the name generalized tuple space search might have been a better name for this algorithm. The idea is the following: let's just partition the rules into the smallest number of groups, where each group is associated with a bit mask, so that the following constraint holds. The rules in each group, when we mask to the group's bit positions, are order independent. Okay, so this is basically just saying the previous two principles, the two invariants, and turn them into an actual algorithm. Okay, so we just basically just collect a couple of rules so that these groups partition the rule set, associate a bit mask with each and every group, and the idea is that we create hashes on these masked bit positions for each group. Okay, and the idea here is that as long as the constraint holds, so the rules assigned to a single group are order independent, then basically the basic idea of tuple space search will work. Interesting thing here is that we may lose valuable bits in each group. So of course, the idea in tuple space search is that basically we take all the non-relevant bits and write them into the hash. In this case, whenever we assign rules from different tuples to the single hash, we might lose valuable bits in each group, okay, because we have to apply a common mask. So the old trick that I first seen in a SACSPAC paper was that we can do a false positive check as long as the rules are themselves order independent. It means that from each group we only have just a single match, and that single match can be false positive checked after each hash lookup. So we're going to see just, okay, the hash reports that there is a match on this rule, and at most, this is the only rule that can match from this group. But let's just do a false positive check. Does it really match, or is it just because we lost valuable bit positions in doing a reduced decomposition? Why I get this match? Okay, now the nice idea here is that tuple space search is the worst case order independent reduction. So we can reasonably expect that this simplification, this generalization, we get fewer hash lookups for us. And this might be worth the additional false positive check after each lookup. False positive checks are very simple, actually coded up these things in AVX and DPDK, and it's really basically comes for free. Okay, the nice thing about, of course, we do lots of theoretical work and evaluations of these algorithms, and the simulations show that this pretty much reduces the number of different hash lookups that we have to do for each packet from the relatively high number for tuple space search to usually very slow numbers. So these small numbers. So this is basically just working this idea. But maybe in the last slide, let's just give an example of what we are talking about here. Stefan, can you go to the next? Okay, thank you. So here is the previous IPv6 forwarding table, and recall that tuple space search needed 3 hash lookups. Now, the big idea here is that if you somehow manage to observe that F1, F2, and F3, these 3 rules, if you just constrain them to the first 2 bits, so bit 0 and bit 1, you still get an order independent, an exact matchable classifier. And then, of course, F4 goes to the other classifier. Then basically the reduced order independent decomposition now just contains only 2 hash lookups. Okay, so imagine that you get the input, say 1, 0, 0, 0. You will immediately get a match from the first hash, and then the false positive check will report that, of course, it matches on the first 2 bits. But of course, since the packet is 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, it also matches on all the number of bits of F1, so we're okay. And this is the only rule that can match from this group. Of course, this can also match from F4, but here we don't have to do a false positive check, and so the rest of the bit positions are wildcards. And then we take the higher priority rule, F1, and off we go. So the big idea here is that with this additional false positive check, we actually brought down the number of hash lookups from 3 that was default for tuple spaces to only just 2 hash lookups, plus of course a false positive check. And then when I actually thought that I understood what's going on here, Kirill came up with this crazy solution that you can see in this last last 2 figures. Basically show that it's in this specific example, 2 hashes is the absolute lower bound, but you can make all these hashes to match only just a single bit of these filters, and you are still okay. So this was what really shocked me, that you managed to come up with these sorts of crazy examples, where such a relatively complex thing that you can see in the top of the slide, it can be just reduced in these super simple things that you can see on the bottom of the slide, and this basically, I think, closes this now nicely summarizes this talk, that that these are the typical ideas. Stefan, can we go to the next slide? So this is exactly these types of ideas why I really love to work with Kirill, and quite frankly, these are the sorts of ideas that really keep me on well into my 40s to still work on academic research and things like that, because I really find these ideas to be so beautiful and so simple that it's really just a huge joy in working on Kirill's solution. I really miss his creativity and his unique ability to actually come up with these original generalizations of things that I thought I knew for like something like 10 to 20 years, like tuple space search, and then it turns out that there are lots of interesting things to still say about these sorts of algorithms. Software packet classification is still an actively researched area. We still get lots of submissions to different workshops and conferences in the related field, and Kirill really made cornerstone contributions to this field. So his ideas will always be an inspiration to the community, especially to me. For me, this SACSPAC paper, this will always remain a cornerstone contribution, and one that keeps on inspiring me for working further on this field. Thank you. Couple of references at the end. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot this.
Thank you very much, Stefan and Gabor, to give us an interesting point of view about Kirill. Any questions? And if no, with your permission, we will take a 10 minutes break. Okay, guys in the Zoom, 10 minutes is fine. Just a second. Sergey, it's fine if we will start in 10 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the scheduled time.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go back in 10 minutes. I will move to Ibro. חברים, אנשי מרכז, רוני. Okay, so our next speaker is, sorry guys, is Dr. Sergey Nikolenko from National Research University Higher School of Economics, St. Petersburg, Russia. And he will talk about competitive analysis for buffer management. Sergey is the head of Artificial Intelligence Lab at PDMI RAS and the head of the AI Synthesis AI. He's received his MSc from St. Petersburg University in 2005 and his PhD from the Stekolov Institute of Mathematics at St. Petersburg in 2009, and he has co-authored more than 150 research papers in machine learning, analysis of algorithms, and even have a bestseller of a deep learning book. So, Sergey.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here for for this unfortunate occasion. And I guess I will also begin with some comments on our collaboration with Kirill and what Kirill meant for me. So this is one of the very, very few photos that I have with Kirill. And I guess this is the best one because it contains not only Kirill and myself, but also Vitaly Demyanyuk, who spoke today, and Pavel Chuprikov, another joint PhD student of ours, and Alex Davidov, who also has been a colleague for many years. This is a photo from 2017. And actually, we have been collaborating with Kirill since 2012, so almost 10 years. This is actually a nice story that I guess I should tell now, because in January 2012, I received an email from Kirill, just completely out of the blue. And this email basically said, hi, Sergey, I'm interested in buffer management, competitive analysis, and I have a few problems. So would you like to collaborate? And I have no idea why Kirill wrote to me. I have no idea how many other people he wrote to at the same time. But I replied. And since then, I think this has been the best research collaboration in my life. And I'm very, very grateful to Kirill for all these years and for all this work that we have done together. And also with other people, of course. I counted before this talk, we've had 43 joint papers. That's obviously the most I have with anybody. And I guess this record will stand. So as for my talk today, well, to be honest, I think I have misjudged the audience. I kind of assumed that since this is a memorial seminar, there will be lots of people with different backgrounds, and I prepared kind of an introductory talk about how competitive analysis is used in buffer management, what it all means, and what were the main results that Kirill brought into the field. Judging from the first several talks, I have been badly mistaken about the audience, but I guess I have no choice.
Sergey, let me interrupt you, but the speakers are familiar with the buffer management and classification, but the audience here are not, so it's good, it's fine.
Okay, good. So anyway, let me maybe for the introduction, let me maybe switch to the whiteboard and just explain what this whole field is about, and then we'll go into the results that Kirill brought here. So, okay, I still think that everybody here is familiar with the general idea of buffer management, right? So you have some kind of a buffer, and packets come in, and the buffer somehow processes them, and obviously we'll come back to that later, and then packets come out, right? So in buffer management, usually there are three parts of what's going on. The first part is the admission of new packets, right? The second part is the processing, which is done inside the buffer. And the third part is the transmission, which is usually relatively simple, where the packets go out and go to their next destination. So this is the general idea, and now the details can be very, very different. And that's why we need this whole science, and that's why we need the whole slew of very different results here. So what can be different here? Well, first of all, obviously the buffering architecture can be different, right? So the buffer can be a single queue where packets are lined up one after another, and there will be results about this case too, although for now it seems trivial, but we will see that it's not. It can be, for example, an output queue buffer where you have several output ports, and each output port has its own queue, right? Or it can be a crossbar switch probably the most complex architecture that we will speak about today, where you have several input ports and several output ports, and you have a separate queue for each pair of input and output ports. So there is a queue on each intersection here, and it can hold its own packets. This would be the crossbar switch. So the first, let me say, the first point of variety, the first branching point of all of these results is the buffering architecture. The second point, and this, I guess, is already where Kirill's contribution come into play, because he was one of the first and definitely one of the most important people in considering this branching point. The second branching point is are the different characteristics of the packets, right? So in the classical works on buffer management, packets are usually assumed to be uniform. So all packets are the same. And of course, this makes, for example, the single queue trivial. If all packets are the same and you have a single queue, you don't have a choice, right? All packets go into the queue, all packets come out of the queue, that's it. But in reality, of course, packets are different and they can have different characteristics. So when a packet comes into the buffer, it may have they may be different, and there are different. And what can these characteristics be? So first of all, a packet can have value, which basically means that some packets can have higher priority, more value, and basically value is what the packet adds to the objective function. So we want to, if we need to drop something, and the whole point of buffer management is to try to avoid dropping packets, try to avoid congestion in the buffer. When there are too many packets, buffer is overflown and you have to drop something, or you have to not admit something. So if the packets have values, then of course you would like to drop packets with lowest values and transmit packets with highest values. If you the packets can also have, and that's definitely some of the Kirill's contribution that we'll consider. Packets can have processing requirements, which means that different packets can require different computational resources from the buffer to process them. And in our papers, it is usually abstracted to a single number, let's say R, the processing requirement, which says how many cycles, how many time slots, and we always assume that time is discrete, how many discrete time slots this packet has to spend at the head of line before it can be transmitted, right? So after each time slot, this number is reduced by 1, and when it is reduced to 1, then on the next time slot it is transmitted and it's done, right? So if you have packets with different processing requirement, then this means that you probably, if they have equal value, you probably want to prioritize packets with low processing requirement because they can be processed faster and they can be transmitted, right? Then there can also be, packets can also have different size. I don't think I'll speak about this kind of setting today, but obviously different packets can take different number of slots in the buffer, different amount of memory. Yeah, and I think that's it. And also there is the obvious characteristic, which is more dependent on the architecture. And that is, for example, in this architecture, a packet would have the output port where it wants to go, right? And in this architecture, a packet would be characterized by a pair of input and output port where it comes from and where it wants to go at the end, right? So these are And basically every combination of these two parameters gives you a different setting, right? And almost all of these settings make sense in various networking contexts. So how do we analyze algorithms? How do we analyze buffer management algorithms? Well, there is, of course, this classical queuing theory, which is mostly a statistical science that makes assumptions about statistical properties of incoming streams of packets. And based on these assumptions, outputs makes predictions about the statistical properties of output streams, right? But in reality, of course, these kind of assumptions are very seldom hold always. And what we really want is we want the switch to perform well in the worst case. So it doesn't really matter how it performs when it's not congested, right? Because it will transmit all packets anyway. But what is important is how it performs at peak traffic times, at times when the incoming sequence of packets is very unfortunate. So these kind of algorithms are usually analyzed with what is called competitive analysis. And competitive analysis means that you have a buffering architecture, right? You have incoming streams of packets, you have output packets, and what you want to maximize is you want to maximize the total objective function of transmitted packets. So in the simplest case, if they don't have values, then you just want to maximize the number of packets that you transmit or the fraction of packets that you transmit compared to what you receive. So competitive analysis means that you take this number, you take this fraction of packets that you transmit with your algorithm, with the algorithm ALG, and let's say there is this objective function, right? And you compare it to the same objective function that could be theoretically achievable with an optimal clairvoyant offline algorithm that just knows everything in advance. It knows the whole sequence of packets. It knows everything. So an online algorithm definitely usually cannot be optimal. Only in very rare cases we can achieve true optimality. So usually the online algorithm will work somewhat worse than the optimal algorithm. But if we can bound it, for example, by a multiplicative constant, if we can say that, sorry, the other way around. If we can say that our algorithm, no, the other way around, there we go. If we can say that our algorithm is at least alpha times worse than the optimal algorithm, then we say that our algorithm is alpha competitive, right? And that is the main theoretical tool for worst case analysis of online algorithms, not only in buffer management, but in other computer science fields as well. And basically, this leads to three different kinds of results. So the first kind of result is a lower bound for a specific algorithm. And a lower bound for a specific algorithm is usually the simplest, the most straightforward kind of result. So basically, all you have to do is you need to provide the counterexample. So a lower bound means that the algorithm is performing badly, right? So a lower bound on the competitive ratio means that you have found a bad case where your algorithm performs that many times worse than the optimal, right? So to prove a lower bound for a specific algorithm, you just need to find a counterexample. And usually it's relatively simple. The second kind of result is a general adversarial lower bound. And that is more interesting already. And that is the kind of theorem where you prove that, say, in a given setting, So for a given buffering architecture and for a given set of packet characteristics for given parameters and so on and so forth, all, or I should say, any deterministic online algorithm is bounded, is at least that competitive. So this is a lower bound for all algorithms, for all online deterministic algorithms. And this is, of course, a more difficult theorem. Now you have a quantifier of algorithms that actually sounds, on the surface, it sounds like a very difficult theorem. But so, and it is more difficult than just finding counterexample, but usually it goes like this. Usually you are just constructing an adversarial counterexample to that depends on the choices that the algorithm makes. So you start constructing a counterexample, which is basically a sequence of incoming packets, and then you say, all right, so if the algorithm drops this packet, then we do this, and if the algorithm drops that packet, then we do that. And this is how you can, and if in both cases the optimal algorithm can do better, because the optimal algorithm knows in advance what's going to happen, then this gives you an adversarial lower bound. So this is a more difficult theorem. And the most difficult theorems are always the upper bounds, right? So here, I cannot give you a simple answer to what is the method and how can you prove an upper bound for on the competitive ratio, but upper bounds are what we are mostly looking for. So if you have an upper bound on the competitive ratio, then it means that this algorithm is good, right? So this algorithm is at most that competitive, which means that we have proven a worst case guarantee on how well this algorithm performs compared to other algorithms. Okay. So this is a brief introduction to competitive analysis and how it relates to buffer management. So now let me go back to the slides, and now let me turn to specific results that, to an overview of results that Kirill introduced to this field. Okay, so I already spoke through this. Each packet can have various characteristics. There we can have many different architectures. And yeah, there is also one more degree of freedom that I forgot to mention. If packets are uniform, if all packets are the same, then it doesn't matter. But as soon as the packets are non-uniform, we also have different variations of how the queues are organized. So for every queue, or for a single queue, if it's only one, you can have, usually it's one of two things. Either you have a priority queue. So for instance, you prioritize high value packets. So then in your queue, the packets will be sorted according to value. Or you can have a first in, first out queue, where the packets are sorted according to time of arrival. And that is usually an external requirement. You're, say, required to do FIFO processing. And so you're stuck with FIFO queues. Priority queues are better, but they also require some additional computation, right, to support this data structure. Okay, and we always assume discrete time. Each time slot contains 3 phases, usually arrival, when new packets come in, assignment and processing. So we choose which packets to process. The slide says a single packet, but it actually depends on the architecture. It can be multiple packets processed. And then transmission. When the packet has been, a packet has been processed, it can be transmitted, it can leave the queue, and that's a good thing, right? Yeah, I already talked through the competitive ratios, and this whole field kind of started in 2001. Maybe you can correct me if there are earlier works, but in 2001 there was this influential work about a shared memory switch where the packets are uniform, but it has several different it has multiple output ports, right? And each output port has its own queue, and the only decision is if the buffer, it has shared memory, so a common upper bound on the memory. And there is only one question: if a new packet arrives and the whole and the memory is full, the buffer is congested, then which queue do you drop a packet from? Because it doesn't matter which packet, they're all the same. So the natural policy is longest queue drop a packet from the longest queue on congestion. And this was, I guess, the first paper where all three of these kind of results appeared. So they showed that LQD is at least square root of 2 competitive by counterexample. They showed an adversarial lower bound of 4/3 on any deterministic online algorithm. And they also showed an upper bound on LQD, which is that LQD is at most 2 competitive. So there is this tantalizing gap between the square root of 2 and 2, which actually we have been closing lately, but that's a very different story. Yeah, let me maybe skip this one. So the first paper of Kirill about this topic dealt with a crossbar switch. So already a very complex architecture, but still, and already non-uniform packets with values. So it had each input port has a collection of queues for each output port, and then from these queues, sub-queues, from these input queues, packets were sent to output queues, right? To queues for the output ports. The buffers were first in, first out, and this was the paper where Kirill introduced, or obviously I don't know the exact contributions, but where the authors introduced what is called the beta preemptive greedy policy, which made appearances in other settings as well. So the input and output buffers are greedy, but we move packets to output queues only if they are significantly better than what we have in the output queue. So we drop packets only if their value, we add packets to output queues, we mark them as eligible for this only if their value is beta times higher than what we have in the output queues. And they proved an upper bound on this, okay? And the next paper that I wanted to mention, and this is our first joint work with Kirill back in 2012. The architecture now is very simple. It's just a single queue, but now packets have different processing requirements. So this is a sample time slot. I guess this picture kind of speaks for itself. So first, new packets arrive, and each packet is characterized by a single number that have uniform values, but they have different processing requirements. And the buffer has some packets when they arrive, right? So we have one free slot in the buffer, say the memory is 5. What we do next is, what we do first, actually, after new packets arrive, we choose which ones to put in the buffer. And in this case, this is a FIFO buffer, so they will go at the end. And also which ones to drop. So we are allowed to drop, to not admit new packets, but we are also allowed to push out packets from the buffer itself. In this case, this algorithm, this is a very natural algorithm. It prioritizes low processing requirements, so it just pushes out packets with highest requirements, and that's how it works, right? So after I will have this, and then we do processing, which reduces this 1 to 0, and when it's 0, it means that we can transmit, and now we have again one free slot, and we are waiting for the new URL. So that's the setting, and this setting was the beginning of our collaboration with Kirill, yeah, again, I will not dwell on the specific results, but let me just say that in our first paper, we analyzed, we tried to analyze this very natural preemptive greedy algorithm, which just pushes out packets with high processing requirements. But it turned out, and this was actually, I think, Kirill's idea, it turned out that it is very hard to analyze this algorithm, right? And the idea was to introduce a new class of algorithms, which will probably not be implemented in practice because, as we will see, they kind of don't make much intuitive sense, but which are much easier to analyze. And then hopefully the results from this, what we call lazy push-out algorithms, will transfer to regular algorithms as well. So a lazy push-out algorithm does the same, but it does not transmit until its whole buffer, its whole queue is full of ones. So until every packet has only one time slot left for processing, so you can basically transmit them all one by one in subsequent time slots. And this sounds crazy, right? This sounds crazy. This sounds like an obviously weakened version of the basic PO algorithm, right? The lazy push-out algorithm does the same as the regular push-out algorithm, but for some reason it doesn't transmit when it can. So it sounds stupid, but actually in the worst case, they're incomparable. You can find sequences of packets where LPO is better. And what is, of course, the most important, we were able to prove a logarithmic upper bound on the competitive ratio of LPO. And it's logarithmic in K, which is the maximal process requirement. So it's usually a constant in practice. So yeah. And then in the next paper, we generalized this a little bit. We introduced lazy versions of many different algorithms, and this was our second, I guess, or third paper, Taxonomy of Semi-FIFO Policies. So we basically defined a class of lazy buffer management policies, and we were able to actually prove a general upper bound for all lazy policies, which also sounds which sounds great, and it's also logarithmic, but this time the base of the logarithm is not as good as before. So they differ in the processing order, and for some processing order this is a tight bound, and as we already saw, for some processing orders we can do even better. Right, so and for the best of them, for the LPQ algorithm, which is lazy but also a priority queue, so it processes and transmits packets in reverse order of their processing requirement, but at the same time it is lazy, so it waits for its buffer to be full of ones before transmission. So for this, we could actually prove that it's too competitive and it's a tight bound. So it's 2 minus some vanishing constant, some vanishing term in the worst case. I will skip these results. Basically, this is a great example of what a paper work in competitive analysis for buffer management looks like. So we consider a specific setting. We introduce specific algorithms. Usually thinking of the algorithms is the easy part. So they are kind of obvious, well, priority queue, but sometimes it takes work to introduce algorithms as well, as in the case of this lazy family. That was not obvious. But then the hard part is, of course, to prove the theorems, right? The hard part is to prove lower bounds, and much harder, prove upper bounds on the competitive ratios. And if you are able to prove, say, a logarithmic or a constant upper bound, then you're good. And if, for example, the lower bound is linear, then that's probably a bad algorithm, at least in the worst case. All right, so with this, I guess I'm almost done. I will just mention a few more settings that we considered in subsequent works. So in the next paper, 2013, we had a multi-queue buffer, and there were 2 different settings here. In one setting, each queue was responsible for packets of a specific kind. So in this case, we still consider different processing requirements, and packets of each specific processing requirement went into their own queues, right? So in this case, yeah, again, there are several natural algorithms that you can consider. And for one of them, we were able to prove a constant upper bound. Let me skip this one. And next, yeah, sorry, this is the same. So yeah, the next variation would be if you have packets labeled with output queues and still heterogeneous processing requirements. So they go to different output queues, and then they get processed in the same way as in our previous paper in a single queue, right? So, but the difference is that now this is a shared memory buffer, so the total memory requirement is to say there is a common upper memory bound for all queues, and you need to choose from which queues to drop the packets. So we consider this with Patrick, who I guess will be speaking right after me. Again, there were two papers. In the first paper, we kind of conjectured an algorithm that might have constant competitiveness, but were not able to prove it. And in the second paper, we disproved this conjecture and proved a different constant upper bound. So those were the results. And maybe I will finish with this couple of papers. The next obvious generalization, or I should say maybe just the next obvious setting, would be to consider packets that have multiple characteristics. So I didn't mention that, but in all of those previous papers, we also considered packets not with required processing, but with values. So each packet takes only one time slot to process, but packets contribute differently to the objective function. Usually the case of values is easier, and usually it was kind of a side note to the main results about required processing. But what if packets have both? What if packets have both heterogeneous processing requirements and heterogeneous values? And in this case, and this is where Pavel actually joined us and started his PhD work. In this case, in the case of a single queue with a single characteristic, it was almost obvious that the priority queue is optimal, and it's very easy to prove. So if you have, say, different values, then you just process and transmit packets with highest values first. It's optimal, obviously. If you have different processing requirements, you process and transmit packets with lowest processing requirements first. It's optimal. All of these previous papers dealt with FIFO processing, where you cannot do that, right? So if you could do a priority queue, it would be obviously best. In this case, it's not obviously best, and actually in this case, there are many different priority queues that you can have, right? So you can have a priority queue that sorts by processing requirement first and then value, or I should say value and then processing requirement. You can have a priority queue that sorts the other way around, so first processing requirement, then value, or you can have a priority queue that computes some kind of joint characteristic, for example, the ratio, like how much unit value do we get from a single time slot of processing. And these are all different cases, and there are different theorems about that. And again, we proved some kind of general lower bound, we proved some upper bounds, and this was also, I guess, a very interesting paper where with a lot of different upper and lower bounds in the competitive ratio. So to sum up, we have seen, I have introduced to you this general field of buffer management with competitive analysis. The whole point is to have worst case guarantees. So all of the theorems that I mentioned, their purpose is to have algorithms with hopefully constant, or at least not very bad, upper bounds in the competitive ratio. So the whole point is to have buffer management policies that are that are guaranteed to work reasonably well, even against adversarial inputs, even against the hardest possible input sequence of packets. And then the whole field branches out in many different directions. So you can have different buffering architectures, you can have different characteristics of packets and combinations of characteristics of packets. So there are many, many constant settings. And of course, Kirill had plans in this field for continuation of this work. And actually, our last works were about extending these same methods of analysis, so the same kind of online algorithms and the same kind of competitive analysis to other fields, such as, for example, job scheduling or analyzing compute aggregate problems in distributed computational environments. But unfortunately, we will have to continue this work without Kirill. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and thank you for the honor of letting me speak at this event. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much. And we have time for one question.
Hi, thank you for the high-level overview. It helped me to understand what this field is about. And I have a very basic question because this is not my field of research, but I couldn't help wondering through the talk why a buffer is actually needed. So I understand the packets are traveling from place to place, but why do you need a buffer?
Well, first of all, you need to send the packets to different destinations in some settings, right? So you need to process, you need to, for example, send them to different output ports. In case of a single queue, if it was just a single queue with uniform packets and you don't have to do anything, then you don't need a buffer. But in our setting, for example, you want to do some kind of processing on the packets inside the switch. And this processing can be different. You can, for example, do packet classification that people mentioned, right? So you want to check the header of the packet and match it against something, and that's one way. Or you can have, say, deep packet inspection and traffic analysis, stuff like this. So anything that, so a switch usually has to do something with the packet before it can transmit it further, right? And the buffer is needed because packets can arrive very quickly, and sometimes there arrive more packets than the switch is able to immediately process. So you need to store them somewhere, and that's the buffer. Did I answer the question, or?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Professor Patrick Thomas Auguster. Patrick?
Hey.
Hi, how are you?
How are you?
Professor Patrick Auguster is Professor of Computer Science at the University of Delle Svizzera Italiana. I said it correctly or not?
Correctly enough.
Okay, you're too kind. In Lausanne, Switzerland. Prior to that, he was a faculty member at Bordeaux University, where he had the honor to work with Kirill, and at the TU Darmstadt. Patrick is interested in all aspects of network distribution system. Patrick, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
You can start, please.
Let's see. Get started. Oh, sorry. I have to restart. I'm not a common Zoom user. 1 second. I have to update some settings here.
Antonio, you will present after Patrick? אני במיוט. רגע, שנייה, הוא חזר. הוא לא שומעים אותו.
Yes, if you need verbal confirmation, it's fine.
Okay, just let's give Patrick 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, good. Patrick? Okay.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that glitch. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, I'm as honored as I am sad to be joining here and giving this talk. Thanks for the introduction. This talk is going to include some work that involved also Patrick Janke, who was a graduate student of mine at TU Darmstadt and then joined SAP. Pavel Chuprikov, who was Kirill's first PhD advisee. I was actually surprised to not see him on the speakers list. And also Gary Neumann, who was an expert in AI for robotics, who was at TU Darmstadt when I was there and recently joined Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. So Kirill joined my group at Purdue around 2013. And he brought with him a number of topics like packet classification and buffer management, which I had relatively little expertise and experience in. But he was very passionate about these and he quickly got me excited and joining the bandwagon. And so that made me realize very quickly what a driven and also scientifically skilled and innovatively and practically thinking person that he was, and how lucky I was to have been able to recruit him. And on top of that, as you all know, he was also a very gentle and humble person. But anyway, so these topics have been covered already pretty well by some of the previous speakers. So I will tell a different story today. So I'm going to talk about some work that he was not really part of, but he laid some of the initial foundations for it, or some of the initial thoughts for it. And that's because I like to think of him as being part of the future and not the past. And also gives you an idea of how even a short conversation with Kirill could leave you inspired for years. So when he had joined my group, I remember we were talking about some of the papers that have been published at SIGCOMM. I think it was at a dinner at my place when we were talking about these works of Google and Microsoft on their software-defined wide area networks and the pros and cons. And particularly, we're talking about some of the assumptions that these works were making and whether these were reasonable or not. And in particular, there was the assumption made that the sizes of network flows are known in advance to perform optimal traffic engineering. And we were debating whether that's feasible, how to do that, if at all. And so we talked about that a while. We did leave the idea aside. We both felt that it would be something really interesting to investigate, but we felt that it was a longer shot. And we did focus back on packet classification at that time, which looking back seemed like it was the right decision because that allowed us to then have that paper at SIGCOMM 2014 that was already mentioned a couple of times today together with Sergey. So yeah, it probably was the right decision. And the problem was eventually tackled somewhat in NSDI 2019, where the feasibility of predicting network flow sizes was investigated. But the idea kept haunting me, and this discussion with Kirill was reverberating in my mind after that. So fast forward a couple of years, SDN, WAN, it was long gone, long forgotten, traffic engineering, grown out of fashion. And people had turned more towards data center network congestion control. They had observed that data center networks were operated at very low load levels. So oftentimes links not loaded over 10 or 15% by kind of configuration. The reason being that these networks were often plagued by congestion. So this, I mean, congestion control is a decade-old area, but it was really reinvigorated through the advent of cloud data centers. And there have been a lot of technical developments that made the problem important again. Particularly, there was the advent of alternative transports to TCPs, such as RDMA, and the desire for lossless networks. And there's been an observation that mechanisms like priority-based flow control that have been introduced to overcome problems in such setups were actually aggravating performance, and in some cases, in the case of PFC, even leading to routing deadlocks with a number of congestion control solutions, which are very, very rare events, but with very, very drastic consequences, which require typically manual intervention to be resolved. And a number of years later, it actually was really, or someone really put the finger in the wound and said that we were reaching the limits of reactive congestion control. So while this work on congestion control was unraveling, this thoughts about trying to predict things, characteristics of network flows, rather than reacting, that thought came back, and we started investigating the problem. We actually took a little bit of more generic stance. So we felt that, or the question that we asked is, what if we could define a generic oracle that allows you to predict fine-grained characteristics of individual network flows? So more precise, the problem is what we call fine-grained network flow evolution prediction, which means that we want to be able to predict at the level of individual flows, so that, you know, if there's say a flow that has a huge increase in bandwidth at some point in time, that may on a certain link then lead to an overuse. We have time to see that coming and to possibly reroute that flow. We want to be able to do this at a high resolution, again, meaning that it's not just about obtaining one or two measurements at a space of 1 second, for instance, but really the trajectory of how the bandwidth evolves at a fine granularity. All of this information is, of course, only useful to you if you get it enough ahead of time so that you have time to actually react to avoid things like congestion. It's, of course, not very useful if you can only do that for a single flow on a switch. So we wanted to be able to scale. And as mentioned, support on switches was very important for this. So it had to be implementable on commodity switches. And this is a very tall order. But we realized this from the beginning, but we were still intrigued by the problem and decided to pursue this. To give you a little bit of more concrete idea of what we mean by this prediction. So here you see the evolution of a network flow from left to right in time. And so the idea is we would observe this flow starting here at tau 1a to the end of some observation interval here at tau 1b. After that, when ingesting this information, we would perform a certain computation in order to do the prediction, and we would get results that would be useful at a certain starting point. So there's this additional lead time after which we can actually really then apply the data, because the information that you would get right here, it's already too late to react to. So in the end, what you get is this green prediction interval here for that first observation interval that I show you. And then by kind of overlapping these observation intervals, so starting the second one here rather than here at the very end, you would get this kind of seamless predictions one after another of the network flow in time. And I'm already foreshadowing a little bit part of the solution, but as you can see here, this is actually something that we observe quite commonly, is that these flows are not kind of continuous in their evolution. So this kind of short, very small, so-called microbursts, one after another, is a very common pattern. And what you can already see very well here is that you kind of have in many cases, a base frequency at which these occur. Now, why do these occur? That's another story, and I don't want to go into that, but this is really what we observe in practice. Okay, so yes, prediction is a huge field, and yeah, ideally we would like to predict the potential for any kind of tragic events in the real world, such as the one that led us all together today here. But it's very unlikely that we'll be able to do that anytime soon. So, if you reduce the scope of what you're trying to predict and you're more specific, then you have better chances of success. So there's been a number of works on very specific types of predictions, for instance, for switch failures, or the work that I mentioned earlier on just predicting the complete size of a flow ahead of time. And those are pretty successful works. They achieve relatively high accuracy. At the same time, they're very specific, which means that it's very unlikely that solutions like these will be deployed, at least with support on switches, because if you need predictions in the end for 20 different protocols, you need to deploy 20 of these solutions on every switch. That's just not going to scale. So these are really just too restricted in scope of what they can do. And that's why we tried to settle for this a little bit broader scope of network flow evolution prediction. In that space, there had been some work already, starting in 2006 with ARIMA and GARCH and many derived works. But all of those were really limited in that traffic is aggregated both in time, meaning that they would use sampling intervals between 1 second and 1 hour, and also in space. So they would aggregate all flows on the same link or on the same path, and really do the prediction in a coarse-grained manner, which for a lot of scenarios is absolutely sufficient. But we felt that for something like congestion control, where really oftentimes the problem is due to short bursts in many different flows at the same time, converging on a same link, and that then leads to congestion and loss of packets. In that case, these coarse-grained approaches really do not suffice, and I'll try to show that a little bit later in experiments that we have. There is some related work, and that's what got us started in this area through this collaboration with Gary Neumann in robotics, where there's been a lot of related techniques used related to the one that I'll be presenting shortly. So when we tackled the problem, we identified a number of technical challenges. First was, for most of these prediction works, you want to reduce the input data. You only want to use the really relevant features so that you can do a timely prediction. If you have too much data to ingest, your predictor is going to take too long. At the same time, we needed to be able to represent the input data, such as to capture system state and its evolution, and in particular bursty behavior. And that's really the important part here. And I'll come back to that a couple of times. The third one was that we wanted to reduce the system state space so that we could work with limited resources. Remember, as I mentioned, the idea is to be able to deploy some of these things on switches and perform prediction at line rate, essentially. And last but not least, we wanted to be able to predict flows based on the learned past of other flows. Now, why is that? If you can predict only the future of a flow based on its own past, well, it already takes you a certain amount of time to learn from that flow so that you can ever predict anything. And that may be too late already, right? At the same time, there's a lot of flows that we observed that are very common in their behavior, be it because they're generated by the same applications, they're conveyed across the same paths in the network, or they have other commonalities. And that actually offers a lot of opportunities for learning from this larger set of data. So quick overview of the solution that we came up with and how it addresses these four requirements. So the probably most consequential decision that we made was to operate in frequency space. So we're using a fast Fourier transform to step from these input time series to frequency space. And the idea, I already kind of gave you an intuition earlier, is that if you look at the way these flows behave over time, there are a lot of these microbursts, and they're oftentimes kind of at a base frequency. So frequency space is really an interesting approach to capture that information and more effective, in our opinion, than time series per se. We use a principal component analysis, a very common technique to reduce dimensionality of the observation space. Nothing much to say about that. The basic technique that we use is the Kalman filter for outlier resistant Bayesian state estimation. originally for linear models with continuous space. But as I mentioned, we have to be able to capture these bursts, which are not linear. And so we introduced a kernel Hilbert space, or essentially we're using the so-called kernel trick to transform the common filter in order to be able to deal with nonlinear models. And then last but not least, we use a subspace kernel common filter to reduce the size of the kernel matrix, because when in the end, everything boils down to, in terms of computational complexity, is more or less matrix to matrix multiplication. And trivially, the complexity of that will hinge a lot on the size of any of the matrix dimensions. So that's just kind of a high level overview. For those who prefer graphical depiction, you can see here the measured data and the training data both coming in, both being transformed to frequency space. Then PCA is applied to extract the relevant features. There's an additional step. We use a k-means clustering. I'll talk a little bit maybe about that briefly later, that I'm not representing here for simplicity. And then there's the frequency-based kernel common filter here with all its components, the system model, observation model being embedded in the reproducing kernel Hilbert space, and then contributing to the prediction here with the actual Kalman filter. As mentioned, important aspect of this work was to be able to implement this on switches. And quickly became apparent to us that we couldn't rely on existing monitoring solutions to get information on individual flows at the rate that we needed at the scale that we wanted to, for a large number of flows. So we ended up designing and implementing a new monitoring solution, which we've also used in a number of other projects in the meantime, that essentially uses a lot of resources in the control portion or the management portion of the switch, so not really in the data plane, to run so-called monitoring instances that just pull information from the ASIC statistics about the flows, and then execute the kernel common filter. Currently, this is implemented for Open Network Linux as well as Arista EOS, and we've also ported it to the Stratum platform, which allows it to be deployed on other systems. So we did some initial evaluation of this approach. We used two data sets. One was a corporate data center trace data set that we got from a production data center of SAP, which is predominantly machine-to-machine communication. Another one, the first one that we had actually, was a data set from paper from Theo Benson in the Internet Measurement Conference 2010, which was from a university data center, which involved traffic that had more human involvement, such as HTML traffic. An important aspect of our evaluation is that we for both of these data sets, we just from the get-go split them in two each. And we said, we're going to train on the first half of the flows and then predict on the other half of the flows. Because as you might remember, important goal for us to be able to learn also from other flows. So I really want to put that to the test that way. And in addition, we also split these data sets in time. So we learned essentially on the first half of the flows from the first half of the timeline, and then predicted on the second half of the timeline, but on the second half of the flows. So really there's no overlapping between trained and predicted flows, neither in time nor in space. So here's a quick overview of some of the results that we observed. I mentioned briefly the k-means clustering. So we did originally manually inspect these data sets and identify so-called clusters of flows that were similar in behavior. And we kind of grouped these, and we essentially have for each group or cluster of flows, we have its own model. But that means we don't have to have a model for every flow individually. That will be, of course, too costly. But again, we do share information between flows. As long as these are similar, that works pretty well. So the results that we see here with our approach that we dubbed Claire are around 10, in some cases 20% average prediction error. Negative means that we, on average, underestimate the bandwidth of flows, and contrast that with these earlier approaches, which are much more coarse-grained, as I mentioned, where your predictions are really strongly off. We also did some experiments with neural networks, various types, various parameter settings. We were pretty hopeful in the beginning that we could really just replace the Kalman kernel by a neural network eventually, but we observed very poor results. The reason here being in particular that these kind of gravitate towards the mean value of the bandwidth rather than really trying to predict the peaks or being able to predict the peaks. And I'll show you briefly on another figure shortly. For the university data center traces, we had very similar results. Not going to go over all of them. We had some groups here where the approach really didn't perform that well. So 40% prediction error on average. Probably not useful for these groups of flows, but for a lot of other groups of flows, very small prediction errors, which seems to indicate that this could be a viable path for the future to perform proactive congestion control, for instance. As promised earlier, let me zoom in really quickly. Here's one sample taken of a flow, and it shows the ground truth. So the flow really evolved, and how these approaches, some of these approaches performed. And this is not like we didn't choose one where our approach was best and the others were worse, but this is really just a random one. So it's very much in the average of what we observed. So you see the black line here is the ground truth. So this is how the thing performed, the red one is the prediction with our kernel common filter. So the red line, which is very close and captures the bursts pretty well. Here, of course, there's some cases where the values diverge a little bit from the ground truth, but by far and large, the general aspects are really well captured. The neural network here, the convolutional neural network, as mentioned, it tends to gravitate towards the median value of the bandwidth. So it fluctuates a little bit in the beginning because the median still changes a lot, but then over time it just flatlines here, becomes just pretty stable around the median, and is not just simply unable to capture any of the more fine-grained bursty behavior. And then lastly, there's this prior work, which was a more coarse-grained approach, which shows you how some of the trends can be kind of captured, but some oftentimes with delays, or really just totally underestimating the peaks here. Here again, you see really that the trend is kind of foreseen, but not at the amplitude at which it really then happened. So this technique not really useful in this context. But again, that's not what it was designed for, so it was okay. Quick idea about the implementability on switches that I alluded to earlier. So here we're showing the CPU usage in red on a switch while monitoring between 20 and 100 network flows through their individual monitoring instances. We were using at the maximum case here 50% of one management CPU core. So that's one management CPU on the switch that is being used half of its capacity for these 100 flows. The other bars show the accuracy that we're able to achieve for polling the statistics from the ASIC. So essentially, we're using a timer here set at 10 milliseconds. Every 10 milliseconds, we try to extract the information from the ASIC, the statistics on these flows. And if we're willing to tolerate a little bit of a discrepancy on that polling timer, then of course what we perceive as accuracy is a little bit higher. That's these green bars. In terms of the prediction, the results are very similar between these two, so there's not really any large price to pay. So it just shows that there's a little bit of leeway here in terms of the resource usage. Another measurement that we did was CPU cycles. Without going into too much detail here, you can also see Claire is relatively friendly in terms of CPU cycle usage compared to these other approaches. Some really require a whopping amount of CPU cycles, which just makes them impractical, despite, in this case, really just providing very coarse-grained information. Last but not least, I want to go back quickly to our motivation. Can we really use this in practice to avert these potentially drastic scenarios of congestion and of packet loss in the end? So Pavel put together this nice NS2 simulation performing traffic engineering based on the information obtained from Claire. So what we used was a simple backup path for rerouting traffic. For simplicity, the backup path didn't have any capacity constraints. And here you can see the simulation started with a number of flows being given to it, and then these kind of ran their course. So you can see at the beginning here, the accumulated packet losses kind of increase gradually. If we don't perform any kind of prediction, don't try to be any smart, don't do anything smart about these losses or prevent them. And then at some point it kind of stabilized a little bit, because then again, as mentioned, kind of the flows run their course, and the simulation just runs to the end. If you use the backup path always naively, in this case, because of the absence of a capacity constraint, you can see, of course, you will never lose any packets, but that's, of course, a very poor solution and not practical. The interesting part here in this graph is, however, that here we did this so-called ground truth measurement, which was, in fact, a perfect prediction. So this is the scenario where we know all of these flows' behavior absolutely in advance, and we can already in advance compute when we would have to switch a given flow to the backup path, right? So here's as good as it gets, and you can see you still lose packets, of course. There's still some scenarios where too many things converge on one link, and even if you try to, if you can reroute things, then there's just at that point in the network, there's just a bottleneck. So you still lose some packets here with the black line, but you can see that our solution, Claire, which only switches to the backup path when it, at runtime, determines the potential for congestion, behaves very, very closely to that ideal solution. And it wouldn't get any better than that. Here's another measurement which shows you the cumulative throughput. So clearly you can see that without any attempt of solving problems with congestion, of course, you lose packets, and we didn't bring in retransmissions here. So your throughput goes down. The backup always solution will allow a little bit of higher throughput, or in this case, you can really think of it more as a good put in this interval here, where you're incurring most of the packet losses. But other than that, it's not performing that much better than the ground truth and Claire traffic engineering itself, right? And then lastly here, the backup path usage. Of course, if you always use the backup path, then use a high amount of resources there, but that's not viable in practice. If you never use the backup path, you never use it. But here again, the important part is you can see that our prediction works very, very closely to the optimal that you could get knowing everything in advance. Okay, so in summary, I think these results, at least to us, seem promising, and I like to still think of this initial conversation that I had with Kirill back then as having kind of tipped the first domino stone that led us down this path. We believe that the solution can be made applicable for traffic engineering, but also congestion control, and we're working on a corresponding solution specifically. We have several refinements in mind for the technique itself, and we're also looking at alternative techniques. As mentioned, we did spend quite some time digging into neural networks. Okay.
Patrick, thanks a lot. Any question? Yes, you need to push. Wonderful.
Yeah. So I'm not in the field, but it seems like you try to predict the stock market while you use Kalman filter, which is extremely, I don't know, smoothing in nature. Is more for like filtering position or timing or something like that. Why not using a more hectic filter that more is, what is the idea behind using Kalman filter? And another question is that, is there any distributed version of that? So if I know say, amidst approximated conjective approximation, maybe I could use it for predicting mine.
So yeah, but these are several questions. So the simple, lazy answer to the first question is that this collaboration that we started with these people in robotics show that they had a lot of scenarios where data was relatively similar to what we were observing on these network flows, and they had been using Kalman filters for decades successfully in these scenarios. And so that originally just told us, okay, we can give this a shot. And compared to other techniques, it's still a relatively simple one. And I think the results indicate that it actually doesn't smoothen that much. It actually smoothens a lot less than, say, something like a neural network, at least in what we observed. For the second part, so we have some, I mentioned we have some extensions in mind and some refinements. So we have also thought about trying some more distributed approaches to this learning, also some kind of rewarding, which is distributed or based on input that we gather in a distributed way to kind of guide the prediction in a more globally optimal manner, longer term. I don't know if that answers the question.
Patrick, thanks a lot. Last
you.
but not least is Dr. Antonio Fernandez-Ante from AIMDA, Spain. Antonio?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, just let me introduce you shortly. Antonio is a research professor in AIMDA Networks. Previously, he was a full professor at the University Rey Juan Carlos and was in the faculty of the Universitat Politécnica de Madrid, where he received an award for his research productivity. He was a postdoc at MIT and spent sabbatical years at the Bell and MIT labs. He has more than 25 years of research experience and more than 200 scientific publications. Right now, he is also a senior member of ACM and IEEE. Antonio, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Okay. Let me first say a few words about my experience with Kirill. Like Sergei Gorinsky, we both met him in Bangalore a few years ago, and he was very. I think I was shocked by his presentation because he was very insightful but very different. And then we started talking about the possibility of joining there, and he applied, and I was very glad that I was able to support his application, and I'm very happy when he joined. He ended up on the office next door, which means that we saw each other quite a bit. And I'm actually missing a lot his loud voice across the wall, because he, when he has these technical discussions, he tends to have he used to have like a very high volume discussing with Pavel or Vitaly or Sergei Nikolenko when he was visiting. So it was feeling like something was happening. I must say that I didn't do a lot of collaboration with Kirill. Unfortunately, I did some. But every time we had some discussion, and in fact, he was always willing to discuss technical stuff. I was very surprised how rich his knowledge is, or was, because of his background. He spent roughly 10 years in Cisco, and then he went to academia. And although he had a lot of practical background from the engineering position he had in Cisco, at the same time he had a deep theoretical background. If you saw the presentation of Sergei, on competitive analysis, that is pure theory, and he had a very strong background on doing theory as well. And he was always, throwing out ideas. He was extremely generous with new ideas and new topics that, as somebody was already pointing out, they were on the one hand, they were simple enough to be practical because of his engineering experience. He always looked for simple solutions that were, that could be really deployed and run. But at the same time, they were non-trivial, and that was really nice. So as I said, I mostly worked with him in two topics. One was working on networks topologies in which you had bandwidths, and this was work with Sergey as well. And the idea was how to simplify those topologies using essentially graph theory in order to make a much smaller network in which you could deploy routes and schedule packets. And the other main work is on we're doing with Vitali, still not completely finished, not completely published, in which the idea is to simplify a whole network into a buffer system. And both of them are really nice and simple ideas that allow traffic engineering in a much simpler way than what is done now with using the whole huge network. I don't know, I always found him very positive, very optimistic, always smiling. And I think the photo that has been used in the poster of this workshop, I think is what I remember him, always smiling. About the talk I'm giving, is not a work that I did with him. It's not a work I did with Kirill, but it's very Kirill-like topic. It's a very Kirill-like topic. It's on scheduling. It's not scheduling packets. It's scheduling tasks or scheduling jobs. But essentially, I'm bringing it here because this is the topic I would have liked to bring to him. This would have been like, the other two papers, he brought the problems and I just helped. And actually, most of the work was done by him and the other co-authors. I just contributed a little bit. This one, I think he would have been able to provide very nice ideas of how to tackle it. So it's more like a cry or a call for help that I'm not going to have than showing something that we did already. But it would have been nice to have him around to be able to discuss this problem, because it's a new model that we just proposed, and we think that he would have had something to say about it. Okay, so as you see, as I mentioned, this work is on task scheduling. The motivation of this work comes from network function visualization is one application. You have a network in which you deploy network functions. They are deployed in the network elements, typically the routers, and network services are just a composition of invoking some of these network functions by defining a chain in the network. So you have like packets or that are going to be traversing the network, and they're going to be reaching network elements in which they're going to be processed by these network functions. So as you see, you have different tasks, which is the processing that each packet is going to suffer in a function. And what you have is a job, or what we call a job, which is the composition of all these different tasks. Another motivating example, motivating scenario is what is called osmotic computing, which is just the composition of microservices. Now microservices are becoming more and more popular, deployed, and they can be deployed in edge elements or edge infrastructure or in the cloud infrastructure. And the users, what the service that a user receives is just the composition of having these microservices processing a user request. So like a user request is typically being is the consequence or the result of being processed in several microservices, one after the other, in a potentially dependent way. So having this in mind, what we came up with is with a theoretical model of a system in which we have jobs, which are these network functional utilization chains or these osmotic user requests, in which we're going to have jobs that are going to be arriving into the system. There's going to be a set of servers, which in the context of the previous motivational examples would be the network functions or the microservices. And these jobs are going to be injected by an adversary, and they're going to be formed by tasks that have to be executed in these servers in a dependent manner. So jobs, will have tasks in which one task cannot start until the previous task has finished, for instance. And the system, or us, which are the one that are controlling the system, are going to have the power of scheduling these tasks at the servers. And I'll give more details now. So what is a job? Essentially, a job, the way we define it, is a set of tasks, K1 to KLK, and a feasibility function. Let me look a little bit more carefully at what a task is. So essentially, a task is going to have two parameters. One is in which server the task has to be executed. And the second parameter is how long it takes to execute that task in that server. So we have a collection of tasks here. Each of them has these two values associated, okay, in which server and how long that server has to run the task in order for the task to be completed. Now, this feasibility function is the one that determines the dependence between these tasks. So given a task, the feasibility function of a task is just returns a set of sets. That's why I was showing here this like the power square of the set K. So what returns is a set of sets where each set in this value is what we call a feasibility set for the task. And we say that a task is feasible as soon as any of these sets is somehow completed, meaning that all the tasks that are in the set, so A1, A2, AL, they're all sets of tasks. As soon as any of these sets have all its tasks completed, the task KI is feasible. That means that the task KI can be scheduled or executed in the server SI corresponding to the task. So as you see, essentially, what we have here, this feasibility function is giving us an or and condition or dependence between tasks. So all the tasks within a set must be satisfied. So it's an and condition. But any of these tasks, any of these sets, any of the feasibility set is enough to be able to advance or make the task feasible. So that's the or part. Okay. So let me give an example. Here we have two jobs, job J and job K. In this job, all of them have the same number of tasks from 1 to 5. And these are this is the feasibility function. So these are the sets. So for job K, FK, what we have is that in both cases, the first task has as a function the empty set. That means they're automatically feasible as soon as the job arrives into the system. And what I'm showing here on the right is kind of the skeleton, what we call the skeleton, which is, which task, how tasks depend from each other. Although 2 shown here depends from 1 and 5, in both cases, their dependence is different because in the task FK, there is an OR dependence, while in the task FJ, it is an AND dependence, meaning for FJ, both tasks have to be completed in order for task number 2 to be feasible. In the first, in FK, either of them is enough in order to have 2 feasible. So if this task number 1 in both cases is feasible, that task can be completed. And as soon as this task is completed, in the case of FK, the task 2 becomes feasible, while in the FJ, task 2 is not feasible yet because 5 is still not completed. That means that FK, task 2 can be run, it can be completed, and the rest of the tasks can be completed. This separates jobs into 2 sets. A job in which all tasks can be completed starting from the first task that don't have any condition to be feasible is what we call a doable job. On the left, what we have is a job that is not doable. And we don't want to have undoable jobs because, essentially they cannot be completed. So we're going to focus only on doable jobs. When we have a doable job, we can assign layers to the different tasks. Essentially, a layer is defined recursively as how many layers to the left or before have to be completed before that particular task becomes feasible. So for instance, in this example, we have the first layer is formed by these 2 tasks, 1 and 2, because they don't have any prior dependence. So this is layer 1. As soon as this layer is completed, we look at, once we complete this layer, we obtain layer 2 by looking at which tasks are feasible. And since the only one that is feasible, having completed 1 and 2, is 3, 3 is the only task in layer 2. Observe that layer 4 still requires 3 to be completed, 5 requires 4, and 6 requires 3 and 5. So neither of 4, 5, and 6 belong to layer 2. Now, when layer 2 is completed, when layer 1 and layer 2 are completed, what we have is that both 4 and 6, sorry, and is this correct? Sorry, it seems to be an error here. Yeah, 6 is not. 6 requires a 5, so there's an error here. So actually, 4 belongs to layer 3, 5 belongs to layer 4, and 6 belong to layer 5. So this image is not correct, but I hope that you understand what I'm doing here. Having these properties, we can define the overall condition of the system. So what we said at the very beginning is that we have a set of servers, we have an adversary that ingests jobs, and we're gonna have a policy. So now we define what a job is. Now let's define what an adversary is. And we're gonna have an adversary that is able to inject as many doable jobs. It should not inject jobs that are not doable because they can never be completed. So we're gonna have an adversary injecting doable jobs, and we don't allow the adversary to inject infinite number of jobs. The adversary is bounded in the sense that it cannot overload any server in the system. So that means that if we look at any time interval I, and this has to be satisfied for all I, and we look at the total execution time of the jobs assigned to a given server from the jobs that are inserted in this interval, this is what we call N. So N of S of I is the load in terms of total execution time that the adversary is injecting during the interval I that has to be executed in server S. This has to be bounded by R times the length of the interval plus B, where R is some in what we call injection rate, or it could be called the load rate, and it's a value between 0 and 1. So when R is 1 means that we allow the adversary to load every single server to 100%. When R is 0.5, it means that servers in the long run are only loaded 50%. And B is a burstiness parameter that allows to instantaneously inject a burst of load. So it allows to, in a certain instant or in a certain interval, to go above the average of R by this value of B. Now, what do we want? So essentially, we are giving the adversary a lot of control because the adversary injects jobs, and as long as these jobs are doable and this load is satisfied, this load restriction is satisfied, the adversary is free to inject any collection of jobs she wants, okay? So the only tool that we have to fight or to control the evolution of the system and to fight the adversary is the scheduling policy that is going to be used in each server. So what is this scheduling policy? It's just the policy that is followed by every server to choose among the tasks that are feasible, among the tasks that are ready to be executed, which one to execute next. Our objective is to guarantee stability. Our objective is to guarantee that the total number of jobs in the system at all times is bounded by some value that doesn't depend on time. Essentially, it doesn't grow forever, okay? And this is just a generalization, or this is a non-trivial generalization of the model of adversarial queuing theory that was defined for network packing, scheduling and routing. Essentially, in adversarial queuing theory, what we have is a network, and the idea is to inject, instead of jobs, what we inject are packets, and those packets have to follow a route or a path inside the network. And the adversary controls when these packets arrive and which route they have to follow, as long as no link is loaded more than a fraction R, which is the same parameter that we use here. In this model, we move from packet routing and scheduling to job execution and scheduling. Having made that, what's good is that it is easy to transform scenarios of packet routing. For instance, this is what they call baseball graph, and we used this graph in adversarial queuing theory to prove many negative results. In particular, it was shown that policies like FIFO in this graph can be made unstable for certain values of R. So what is being shown here is how we transform this network for packet routing into a graph that represents the dependency between servers given their tasks. So essentially, each link becomes a server, and a node that connects one link to another becomes a link, saying that a packet, when we have a scenario in which we're routing packets that cross E0 and F0, in this scenario we have a job in which there is a task that runs in S1 and then another task that depends on the previous one that runs in S2. And we can just transform an execution in which packets are being routed to an execution in which jobs are injected and tasks are executed in this other scenario. By doing that, we can create networks that show that FIFO, LIFO, farthest from source, and nearest to go. These are, I won't go into this because I don't want to take too much time, but you probably understand what I mean by FIFO and LIFO. FIFO means for a given server, it gives priority to the task that has been waiting in the queue and has been feasible for the longest to be executed next. And this is an obvious policy. It's a very popular policy, right? You schedule tasks as they arrive. What is being shown here is that doing that is actually, it may not be the best solution because it may lead to instability in the system. It may lead to have a set of jobs that grows forever in your system. However, the good news is that there are other policies. In particular, there is the policy that gives priority to the job or the task that has been the longest in the system, essentially the task that belong to the oldest job among those who are feasible for a given server. If we use that policy, then we can bound the time any job spends in the system by the maximum TI, which is, if you remember, TI is the time a task takes to execute in server SI. So if we have a bounded value for this maximum time or execution time of any task in any server, then we can show a bound on how long any job is going to spend in the system, and that means that we have a stable system as long as R is smaller than this ratio T minus divided by T plus. When T minus and T plus are equal, then this means that for any R smaller than 1, any system that is not loaded up to 100%, this policy is stable independently on the adversary, independently on the set of jobs that arrive. Looking at particular jobs, we can build a topology of servers by just showing how, essentially connecting a server to another server whenever a task that is going to be run in S1 depends on a task that is running in S2. And I don't want to take more time on this, but I hope you understand. Essentially, what I'm showing here, for instance, there is a link between S1 and S2. This solid link here comes from this job, and it's because task 4 that is executed in S2 here depends on task 1 and 3, that are executed in S1. And that is what creates this link here. Essentially, we can create a topology like this for any collection of jobs. And if we restrict the adversary to inject in such a way that the jobs that are injected have a certain topology, in particular, if what we have is what we call a feed-forward topology, meaning that the topology of all the jobs, you just create this topology for all the jobs that can be injected, and they have a directed acyclic graph, like in this case, all the links, as you see, all the links go from left to right. Then we can show that any work conserving policy, FIFO, LIFO, longest system, you name it, is stable at any rate, no more than 100%. Of course, you cannot go, if you go above 100%, the system cannot be stable. So this is actually the best you can get. You can go as high as 100% and still the system will be stable. So I don't want to go into more detail here, but as you see, I'm just giving one positive example in scheduling policies, one positive example in the topology. There's still many open questions of what can be done in this model, and in particular, what if the topology is a ring? This is something that we know from adversarial queuing theory, that in adversarial queuing theory, in the packet routing and scheduling, the ring topology is stable. However, we haven't been able to prove the same result for this model yet. So that's the next, in our case, more interesting open question. But there are many more open questions, because this is a generalization. It's much richer. It's a much richer model that the original packet routing and scheduling model that we were inspired on. So thank you. And well, thank you, Ariel University, for organizing this event and for inviting me.
Antonio, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. So let's first thanks our speakers for all the efforts. And if somebody like Pavel or somebody else wants to say something or show something about Kirill, Pavel, do you want to start? Pavel, I'm not seeing you, but okay. Okay. In a moment, we will show a short movie that Pavel sent us. Till we will manage to show the movie that Pavel sent us. If somebody wants to say something, please just open the mic and say some word about the Kirill. If not, I will say a couple of words. I know Kirill for something like 10 years, I think. We did our PhD together under the same supervisor, under Misha, Professor Michael Segal. And when Misha called me and told me that Kirill wants to come back, immediately I called him and told him that I want him to join us in Ariel. Took like a year to convince him to come to Ariel, and the moment he decided, I was very happy, and we tried to work together and collaborate, and even Chen and Kirill and Vitali published together, and we succeed to arrange a collaboration between Kirill and Mellanox, which is today is NVIDIA, and unfortunately, it's happened. We miss him a lot, and I hope that we can, let's say, continue to publish as much as Kirill did, and collaborate with as many as his friends. And I want to announce that we are in the Ariel Cyber Center, wish to further commemorate Kirill by introducing a 5,000 shekel annual student scholarship in his name. that we will start from this year and continue further.
Hi, my name is Paul Chuprikov. Currently I'm a postdoc at the University of Lugano. I've been working with Kirill since 2014, and under his supervision, I did my PhD defending in 2019. The limited time I have, I choose to remind myself of the two things that Kirill deemed important. One is about being a person, the other is about being a researcher. The first is the value of a frank discussion. No matter how difficult the topic can be, being open and honest is essential to maintaining a healthy relationship and also to save the relationship that otherwise could be needlessly broken. Kirill made me aware of that and has been a great example. The second is the value of design principles. These were brought up numerous times during our discussion with Kirill at different stages of the project, shaping our goals, results, presentation, and future work. And I'm still learning, searching, and erring, but Kirill made the search for design principles a guiding light on my journey, of which I'm thankful. To conclude, Kirill has built a great foundation for me. And yeah, it's still very sad that he's not going to be around.
Thanks to Pavel. Yes, Alexander.
Hello, yeah, my name is Alexander Shalimov. I'm from Moscow, for now, for Moscow countryside, as you can see. I met with Kirill in 2012 at SIGCOMM. We had a lot of conversation. I helped him with the decay experiments with advanced IP lookup project. Even we had maybe 3 papers together. Kirill had great mind. He was open. He had great ability to communicate with different people. He had a lot of ideas, future plans, and of course it's tragic. So it's impossible to understand that this happened. Thanks a lot for organizers that we have this workshop. Thanks everyone for presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Any other wants to say something? Somebody else? Okay. If not, we will thank you all for your time, effort, and hope to see you in other circumstances. Thanks a lot to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.